Chapter 610. What? Lord Arms, do you recognize this ice dragon? Grim asked curiously as he led Arms around the metallic city. Arms hesitated for a moment before nodding with difficulty. By the way, Lord Arms, how did you know we were here? Arms' human form was that of a tall man in exquisite blue armor. He had a handsome face and a tall posture, and every movement he made had an indescribable aura about him. Hearing Grim's question, Arms rolled his eyes, showing an expression that said, "You still dare to ask me? That's a good question. Since I've already given Zachary to you, you should know the location of my territory, right? Travel 70,000 kilometers northeast from the Stoneclaw Mountains. After passing through the territories of the 12 Dragon Lords, you should be able to reach Lord Arms' Thunder Cliff." Grim answered without hesitation, as if he had done some research on this. Arms' expression froze. "I thought that erasing the waymark in Zachary's mind would be enough to stop you. Unfortunately, a month ago, I suddenly sensed that a waymark I'd set had been touched, and I knew that something was wrong. In the end, you still managed to obtain the coordinates of Lance from the goblins." At this point, Arms' face was full of vexation. The invasion of the goblins was the first time he'd organized an independent operation after becoming a rank 3 Dragon Lord, and yet he'd already made such a huge mistake. He couldn't help but feel vexed. Strictly speaking, it was the grave mistake it had made that led to the invasion of Lance by this group of wizards. If he hadn't acted so recklessly, Lance and the young dragons wouldn't have met with such misfortune. They would still be able to leisurely enjoy the life of a lord. Hearing Arms' explanation, Grim relaxed a little. The waymark they'd used had been set by Arms himself, so it was completely normal for him to have done something to it. Truth be told, Grim was glad that this was the case. If Arms had found out about Grim and the others through other means, wouldn't that mean that the Magi's movements had already been exposed to the high-ranked dragons? Since Arms had found him through the waymark, this meant that the Crimson family's invasion hadn't been discovered by the high-ranked dragons yet. This was actually very easy to understand. The Dragon Clan had always been a race with a long lifespan. Their attitude towards time was completely different from that of humans. It had only been a month since the Crimson family invaded the Lance Plain. This amount of time wasn't even enough for most Dragon Lords to take a nap. The news of the Metal Castle's existence only spread slowly among the few dragon territories near the Stoneclaw Mountains and the Swamp of Sorrows. As for the dragon territory, which was slightly further away, they knew nothing about their existence, nor were they interested in knowing. Just like this time, he had traversed a distance of 700 kilometers to ambush the ice dragon Alantini. The other party did not seem to be prepared at all. At the very least, they were defenseless against outsiders like them. That was why Grim and the others were able to capture him alive in a mere 15 minutes, even though he was caught off guard by Grim and the others. If that ice dragon knew the inside story, it wouldn't have been defeated so easily and miserably. But now, she had been reduced from a high and mighty giant dragon lord to a person standing on a platform, with all kinds of magi pointing fingers at her and appraising her according to weight. After all, Grim and Arms had signed an agreement to help each other in battle. In fact, they could even be considered allies. However, now that the flames of war had spread to Arms' homeland, the relationship between them had become extremely awkward. "Lord Arms, since we're already here, we won't leave so easily. In order to reconcile our relationship, I feel that I need to understand your attitude." Grim asked bluntly, "How do you plan to deal with the matter of us entering the Lance Plain?" Grim's question was very direct. He was basically forcing Arms to express his stance on whether he was a friend or foe. After all, this Thunder Dragon knew the true identity of Grim and the others, as well as the strength of his family. If he chose to become an enemy of the Crimson family, Grim and the others would have to pay a huge price to take him down. Grim wasn't that stupid. After all, he had only brought Arms to the top of the metal fortress. The core of the fortress was actually hidden hundreds of meters below the surface of the mine. As for the Tier 3 brain monster, Gazruvi, with the support of the enhanced magic furnace, as well as the fact that this was its territory, it wouldn't be any weaker than the Thunder Dragon, Arms, even in its territory. Furthermore, Grimm still had Olivia the Dragon Eater in his hands. If he were to throw her out at a critical moment, he would be able to intimidate the arrogant Thunder Dragon Overlord, even if he couldn't catch her easily. Hence, even though Grimm was only a Tier 2 wizard, he could still calmly face off against Arms, a Tier 3 Dragon Lord, despite having a trump card in his hand. Vexed, extremely vexed. If Arms could use half of his wealth to get the Magi out of Lance, he would definitely agree to it without hesitation. It was a pity that after tasting the sweetness in Lance, it was almost impossible to dissuade them with such minuscule benefits. After thinking about it for a while, Arms didn't know what to do. If it was Arms in the past, he would have used force if he couldn't persuade Arms. However, after the battle in the Goblin's Plain, he had experienced the viciousness, and cunning of the Magi in front of him. If he were to resort to force, Arms looked around the thick and solid guest hall that was comparable to a metal cage, and sensed the powerful spiritual force that lingered around him. Finally, Arms gave up on using force to solve this problem. Since he couldn't drive the Magi out of Lance, he could only settle for the next best thing, which was to ensure that the interests of the Thunder Dragon clan wouldn't be affected. Thus, in the following period of time, the two of them had an open discussion. Half a day later, after obtaining a satisfactory result, Lightning Dragon Arms stealthily left the metal fortress. Magus World, Tower of Destiny. As the dazzling starlight on the astrological platform began to dissipate, Alice's tall and graceful figure slowly appeared. When she walked out of the spell formation with a solemn expression, the little elf Helen, who had been quietly guarding by her side, flew over while scattering fireflies all the way. How is it? Is there any result this time? Little Helen floated to Alice's shoulder and whispered into her ear. So what if I did? So what if I didn't? Alice said with a disappointed expression. There has to be a result. Little Helen said anxiously as she flew in front of Alice. You've already exhausted so much of your life force. If there's no result, little Helen suddenly stopped talking. From her angle, she could clearly see that the silky silver hair of her master, who was less than 100 years old, had turned snow white. Alice's face was pale, and her body was weak. It was as if a gust of wind could easily blow her away. Alice thought for a moment and shook her head with a bitter smile. I'm sorry, but it seems like there's no result this time. Little Helen flew up to Alice, with her hands on her hips, and her cheeks puffed out as she glared at her. Do you think we magic fairies are fools that can be fooled? I can clearly see that after your divination, the spell formation has resonated with the power of the stars, and some obvious abnormalities have appeared. This is a typical sign of a successful divination. How long do you plan to hide it from me? Alice stood up and sighed. So what if it's successful? So what if it's not successful? Fate showed you an impossible path. Doesn't that mean there's no path at all? What exactly did fate tell you? Weren't you asking about the direction to advance to grade 2? Why would fate show you a dead end? Little Helen asked curiously. Alice looked at the starlight on the astrological platform that had yet to completely dissipate. She said calmly, I've divined 3 times in a row. Fate has told me that my only chance to advance to the second order will be in the planar expedition in 3 months. That's an extremely powerful medium-sized plane. Do you think our Tower of Destiny can participate in a planar expedition of that level with our strength? Little Helen was stunned when she heard this. She didn't expect that Alice's opportunity to advance would fall on a foreign plane, and a plane with a powerful indigenous civilization at that. Such a plane had terrifying foreign gods at every turn, and it was impossible for people to enter and leave as they pleased like those small planes. Devouring such a foreign plane would naturally allow any wizard's power to expand rapidly. But in contrast, the difficulty of invading would instantly increase by tens of times, or even hundreds of times. It could be said that if the invading wizard's power was slightly weaker, it was very likely that they would be completely annihilated in these terrifying foreign planes. At that time, not to mention the benefits of the plane, even their lives would be difficult to preserve. Previously, Alice had contributed the world waymark of a large plane to the Northern Witch Leaders meeting. According to tradition, if other Northern Witch factions wanted to participate, they would also have to contribute the high-quality planes in their hands. So after hesitating again and again, the leaders of the various witch factions could only announce the medium-sized planes in their hands one after another. Although they couldn't be as powerful as the large plane Alice had contributed, they also had countless animals, plants, monsters, and all kinds of resources. And Alice's 3 consecutive divinations pointed to a medium-sized plane shared by the Pale Witches, the Fane Plane. According to the rules, the Pale Witches would open a portal to the Fane Plane in 3 months. At that time, all Northern Witch factions could send troops to participate in the plundering of the Fane Plane, and all the gains would belong to their own faction. It sounded very beautiful and a very fair operation, but for the Fate Witches who had few troops, such an opportunity was equivalent to not having it. With the current strength of the Fate Witches, entering a medium-sized plane to plunder was simply asking for death. Chapter 6:11. Isn't there still that Grim? Just as Alice was lost and hesitating, little Helen's eyes suddenly lit up, and she flew up and down excitedly. The last time we went to the Flame Monarch, I saw that his strength seemed to be developing quite well. Perhaps, Alice thought for a moment, and then shook her head. They've just discovered a small plane that's not bad. The power inside is quite troublesome, and not any weaker than the Fane Plane of the Ashen Witches. At this time, it'll be difficult for them to take out enough people. Besides, this is an internal matter of the Northern Witches. He's an outsider. What outsider? Little Helen curled her lips in disdain. The last time he called you over to help him set up the platform, he treated you as if you were his subordinate. Now that you're in trouble, if he dares not help, I'll definitely scold him to death. Alice's elegant brows furrowed, and she reprimanded with dissatisfaction. Helen, I won't allow you to meddle. I was only able to become a destiny, which because of his help, so it's necessary for me to help him do some things. This trip to the Fane Plane will be very dangerous, and I don't want his family, which has just begun to take shape, to disappear into thin air. So, she had just completed a large-scale divination, and her mental and physical strength had been greatly depleted. Now that she was forcefully arguing with little Helen, Alice felt dizzy and nauseous halfway through her words. Her vision darkened, and she fell to the ground. This scared little Helen half to death. She waved her little magic wand and cast a levitation spell on Alice, and then used the power of wind to carry her out of the astrological platform. Grim heard the news a little later. Hence, he first teleported from the Lance Plane to the Goblin Plane, then from the Goblin Plane to the Flame Monarch, and finally arrived at the Tower of Destiny after much difficulty. Even with his strength as a Rank 2 Magus, he felt a little dizzy by the time he arrived at the Tower of Destiny, and his body was unsteady. He hurried to Alice's residence, and saw the unconscious Alice lying on her sickbed. The 7 witches of the Destiny Witch faction, including Sophia, the Berserk, and Chave the Ice Maiden, were all gathered here, their expressions solemn. Seeing Grim's arrival, their faces were filled with displeasure. Grim leaned forward to check on her. Through the AI chip scan, he found that her vitality was severely depleted. Her spiritual force was extremely weak, and the spectrum that represented her vitality was extremely dim. He could not help but ask in surprise, "What happened to Alice? What else could it be?" Of course, it's because I performed too many divination rituals, and the loss of life energy is too severe. That's why. Helen, who was the size of a palm, put her hands on her hips and looked angry. However, before she could finish speaking, Chef grabbed her and tapped her forehead with her finger. She then said to Grim coldly, "Since you have seen the Tower Master, please leave now." Grim was silent for a moment. Then he looked around at the witches in the room. "Although I'm not a member of the Tower of Destiny, I have an inseparable bond with Alice. So, I hope you won't hide anything from me." Chef was slightly startled and was momentarily speechless. On the other hand, little Helen teleported away from Chef's control and appeared in front of Grim again. She floated close to him and stared at him, asking, "Is what you said true? If Alice is in trouble, are you willing to save her?" "Of course," Grimm said resolutely. "Alice's matters are my matters. I will definitely take care of her matters." "That's good." Little Helen's face lit up with joy. Just as she was about to tell him everything, she was interrupted by a cold voice. "Helen, you're too impudent." Alice had woken up at some point, and she forced herself to sit up. She angrily rebuked. "This is a matter between us witches. Why did you call him here?" Grimm looked around at the group and vaguely understood something. He simply sat on the edge of the bed and grabbed Alice's fair and slightly thin right hand. "Alice, don't you know how I feel about you? If you doubt the authenticity of my feelings, you can use that divination spell of yours to test." Before he finished speaking, 7 bright rays of divination light fell on him at the same time. 70% real, 30% fake. Fake doesn't seem like a lie. It really isn't 100% real. Men are all like this. Forget it, forget it. This is still better than the others. For the time being, I'll believe him this time. He's lucky this time he passed. These guys, Grimm's body stiffened, and his forehead was immediately filled with black lines. This Alice in front of him seemed to have a knot in her heart, but with so many ducks surrounding him, even if he wanted to confess, it would be difficult for him to do so. While Grimm was in a dilemma, Alice, who was blushing, began to chase them away shyly. Somehow, after the divination spell, when the witches in the room looked at Grimm again, they no longer had the previous estrangement and strangeness. They all laughed and left the room. When only Grimm, Alice, and the sneaky little Helen were left in the room, Grimm pulled Alice into his arms and leaned his face against her soft, silky white hair, inhaling the faint fragrance of her body. Although Alice's figure was tall and graceful, her body was obviously too thin and weak. Grimm could clearly feel that she was not plump enough, and when his big hands turned over, he could even feel that it was a little uncomfortable. At this moment, Alice was like a shy little sheep, lightly pressing her head against Grimm's shoulder. Her body was slightly trembling, and it was difficult for her to organize her words. Grimm laughed and pulled Alice in his arms, letting her cry out softly. Only then did he raise his head to look at little Helen with a smile. "All right, I've settled your mistress. Now, you can tell me everything from beginning to end." "Oh my, bad man, stinky man. You really want to do bad things wherever you go." Little Helen covered her eyes with her hands and flew around the two like a headless fly. When she saw that Grimm did not make any further moves, she carefully whispered into his ear and told him everything about Alice's advancement and the Fairn Plain. "You can already advance?" Grimm was happy at first, but then he could not help but complain. "Alice, what's wrong with you this time? That's not like you at all. There's no point in hiding anything. You should have told us earlier, and then we could have discussed it together. We would have come up with a solution." Alice separated her 2 small hands and desperately grabbed Grimm's big hands, who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to do bad things. She said shyly, "I'm not worried that you've just brought people into the Lance Plain, and we haven't figured out anything yet. If you rashly withdraw your troops, it will easily cause all your previous efforts to go to waste. Besides, this operation is an internal matter of the Northern Witches, and outsiders are not allowed to take part." Grimm smiled. "I'm not an outsider. I'm your lover. No one can object if I use this name to participate, right?" Although the Northern Witches' territory was dominated by witches, there were still wizards in every faction. However, these wizards had an awkward position in the Northern Witches factions. They were either XXX's lovers or XXX's subordinates. Almost all the wizards were on the fringes of the power system. Grimm was now a Tier 2 wizard and the patriarch of the newly established Crimson family. So he and his subordinates had to lower their status to the witches and participate in this foreign plane expedition as vassals of the witches. Although this was reasonable, it was too shameful for Grimm. However, Grimm really did not care about this. He was a typical pragmatist who put profit above everything else. He was not as strict about his reputation as some of the chauvinistic wizards. That was why he accepted this condition without any difficulty. However, shamelessness in a foreign plane expedition was not enough. They also needed to be strong enough to protect themselves and fight. That was why selecting the members to participate in the expedition became the most important thing. The Tower of Destiny would definitely send all its members, including Alice. There were only 8 witches, and they were all grade 1. As for Grimm's side, the members that could be selected were Grimm, grade 2 fire wizard, Mary, grade 2 vampire, Zachary, grade 2 lightning dragon person, Goblin Ripper, grade 2 magic machine, controlled by grade 1 Tigule, Dracula, grade 1 wind wizard, Bliss, grade 1 insect wizard, Ender, grade 1 poison woman, Dana, grade 1 Medusa, and Guja, grade 1 three-headed hound. The 3 Blood Knights, Pseudo, grade 2 vampires, Vinlier, grade 1 vampire, Gargamel, and the Forest Demon Ava were responsible for protecting the Blazing Flame Monarch with Karen's help. The Goblin Plane was left to Meryl. As for the Lance Plane, they could only rely on the grade 3 Brain Monster, Gazruvi, and the powerful Metal Fortress to defend their territory. Suddenly running into a foreign plane, they were most afraid of being surrounded by the native tribes and fighting a war of attrition. In that case, even an extremely powerful Magus could be tortured to death by a group of natives who were like ants. That was why, after selecting a batch of strong generals, Grimm began to work hard to assemble an elite army. As for the cannon fodder, apart from allocating 100 combat magic machines, Grimm also planned to expand his elemental puppet army. These days, most of the battles were carried out with an endless supply of combat magic machines. However, without Gazruvi and the Metal Fortress, he would have to think of a way to obtain an endless supply of cannon fodder. Chapter 612. With the preliminary list of participants drawn up, Grimm returned to the Metal Fortress. The newly captured Ice Dragon had already been sent to the Blazing Flame Monarch, and he was waiting for a suitable opportunity to trade it out through special channels. The Crimson family's name had already been established after the banquet, and it had left a deep impression on many Magus families. Now, the Goblin Cabbie was making use of his private circle, using the Blazing Flame Monarch's ability to provide high-quality dragons as a gimmick to slowly build up his brand. This made many Magi who had returned empty-handed feel excited. They went to the Blazing Flame Monarch every day, constantly inquiring about the details and timing of the next batch of dragons. Some wealthy Magus families even provided Cabbie with all the information they needed on the dragon's attributes and gender. They boasted that as long as the Crimson family could provide them with a dragon that met their requirements, they would be willing to pay any price. Cabbie was even more astute. In the Goblin shop on the first floor of the Blazing Flame Monarch's Hall, he placed a dragon scale he'd pried off of the ice dragon Alantini. This way, Magi who came to the shop only had to examine the translucent, milky white dragon scale, and they would be able to roughly deduce the density of the dragon's bloodline and innate attributes. In a short period of time, news of the Blazing Flame Monarch obtaining a new dragon spread like wildfire. Many high-ranked Magi sent their own representatives to the Blazing Flame Monarch to discuss the purchase of the Ice Dragon with Gargamel and Cabbie. In a short period of time, the Crimson family station in the Blazing Flame Monarch had even surpassed the 5 great families, becoming the hottest rising family in the Central Continent's Tower Forest region. However, all the Magi who belonged to the Crimson family had gone into hiding, beginning a new round of seclusion. They would be embarking on a journey to a new plane in 3 months, and before that, there was far too much preparation work to be done. First of all, the latest batch of small-scale magic furnaces had to be completed as soon as possible. Not only did the Goblin Ripper that Tigule controlled need them as a source of energy, some large construction machines also needed the support of the magic furnaces. Hence, before entering the plane of Farn, Grimm had to ensure the safety of the Magi and his family. Secondly, after advancing to rank 2, Grimm had been busy with plane expeditions all day. His old job of refining and researching elemental magic puppets had been slack. Now that he was about to enter a mature, middle-ranked plane ruled by the gods, high-grade elemental magic puppets would become an indispensable support. Thus, Grimm had to use this last bit of free time to convert the high-grade elemental crystal cores he'd accumulated into necessary and suitable elemental magic puppets. This was the quickest way to increase his strength. Furthermore, in addition to these conventional methods, Grimm had also created the Plague Poison Spirit and the Sewing Puppet, giving him 2 more methods to deal with his enemies. However, these 2 alchemy creations had their own independent souls and consciousnesses, so it would take a long time to nurture and nourish them in order for them to unleash their full potential. Therefore, he could only act as Grimm's assistant for now and could not be used as his main combat force. Additionally, 3 of the alien bugs with innate abilities that he had been nurturing in the Blazing Flame Monarch's secret room had matured, and they were about to undergo the second phase of bloodline experiments. Grimm couldn't help but feel excited when he thought about how he could completely usurp the bloodline talent of a powerful race. Up until now, it had become extremely difficult for Grimm to rely on daily meditation to increase his spiritual force after entering rank 2. At the end of the day, the original owner of his body was just an ordinary human acolyte with limited talent. Grimm had relied on his perseverance and the help of the AI chip to quickly reach rank 2. However, at this stage, the rate at which his spiritual force increased slowed down and even showed signs of stagnating. If he didn't have any special methods to assist him, grade 2 would be the limit of his current body. If he wanted to take another step forward, he would have to tamper with the origin of his soul or bloodline. Experiments on the soul and bloodline were extremely dangerous, and the slightest deviation would result in eternal damnation. Many Tier 2 sorcerers had turned themselves into something that was neither human nor ghost, all because of some mishap in the process of modifying themselves. Moreover, if this kind of problem involved the origin of one's soul or bloodline, it would be impossible to fix it even if one wanted to. The more changes they made, the more their soul and bloodline would deviate from that of a normal human, until they turned into a strange monster that no one could recognize. One of the main reasons why the Crimson family's Tier 2 dragons were so popular was because the dragon race possessed a powerful physique and bloodline that was universally acknowledged. If they could uncover the secrets of the dragon bloodline, any high-ranked magus would be able to open up a new bloodline development path. Ignoring the inheritance of the dragon bloodline, just the long lifespan and powerful elemental innate talent from the dragon bloodline were things that human magi envied. If they could turn themselves into a dragon bloodline magus, they would be the strongest among magi of the same rank. Moreover, the longer he lived, the more time he would have to advance. Coupled with the powerful elemental energy from their bloodline, it would be easy for them to defeat magi of the same rank. Bloodline sorcerers valued their bloodline power, elemental sorcerers valued their elemental power, and physique sorcerers valued their physical strength. That was why living dragons were the most sought-after bloodline creatures in the sorcerer world. Although titans, phoenixes, hydras, and behemoths were all bloodline creatures that were far more powerful than dragons, they were rare and hard to track. It was extremely difficult to capture them. That was why it was reasonable for dragons to be so sought after by high-ranked magi. The sorcerer world. Wilning, the Northern Witch Territory. As the seat of the Northern Witch Council, Wilning was a neutral territory that stood above the major factions. Especially in the past few years, the witch factions had opened up a secondary plane portal in Wilning, which made the place more and more lively. Today was the day when the Pale Witch faction opened up their plane. That was why there was a large crowd on the road to Wilning early in the morning. When the ordinary caravans saw the arrival of the witch faction, they hid on both sides of the road early in the morning. The coachmen, handymen, guards, and other insignificant people all lay on the ground with their heads lowered, not daring to look up at the other party. Only the leaders of the caravans with noble titles could stand there and silently bow to welcome the other party. Under their respectful gazes, a convoy of extremely tightly wrapped black horse carriages rumbled past their eyes. The four horses that pulled the carriages snorted and moved forward with all their might, looking extremely exhausted. Ed, as the leader of Eddie's Chamber of Commerce, Sir Kingwell traveled this trade route all year round and was no stranger to such a scene. However, his youngest son, Finney, who followed him out for the first time, did not have such knowledge. He hid behind his father and secretly looked at the legendary witches team while gently pulling on his father's sleeve. "Father, which faction are these witches from?" Although Finney's voice was soft, Ed was still shocked. He quickly turned around and scolded him in a low voice. "Silence. Lower your head and look at the ground under your feet. Don't look directly at the carriages." At this moment, a group of black armor guards on both sides of the witches' caravans passed in front of the father and son. Ed hurriedly covered his youngest son's mouth with his hand and turned around to bow to the black armor guards. However, the black armor guards ignored Sir Ed in front of them and continued to escort the black carriages forward quickly. However, at this moment, a carriage in front of Ed and his son ran over the stones in the middle of the road. The tightly wrapped curtains were raised high, revealing a horde of terrifying monsters that were stuffed inside. From their appearance, they looked like a group of skinned humans that had been soaked in a stinky ditch for a few days and nights. Their entire bodies were pale, as if they had drowned. Their bodies were sticky and slippery, emitting a pungent stench. They had no eyelids, and in their deeply sunken eye sockets were a series of milky, cloudy eyes. They were so white that not a single bit of black could be seen. They seemed to be a group of inanimate objects, densely packed in the narrow carriage, not moving at all. However, when little Feeney's gaze landed on them, they immediately sensed a trace of the aura of a human being. Their slimy and slippery bodies abruptly shuddered and began to writhe slightly as they frantically sniffed the aura in the air, becoming restless and uneasy. The commotion in the carriage had obviously caused a chain reaction. Soon, even the carriages around them began to shake violently. Occasionally, they could even hear the roars of some terrifying monsters. "What's going on? Who startled these ghouls?" Unknowingly, two young witches were sitting on flying broomsticks in the sky, hovering above the black carriage without a sound. Following a melodious and strange song, the restless carriages once again returned to peace, and the monsters inside once again went silent. "It's the Witches of Death." The experienced and knowledgeable Sir Ed immediately recognized the two witches based on the style of their robes and badges. His legs gave way, and he sat on the damp soil in shock. Little Fanny, who had made eye contact with the ghouls, had already fainted. "Useless fellas. If you alert those big fellows in the other carriages, they'll definitely eat you all up. You, go inform the people at the front and tell them to pull back to a distance of 30 meters on both sides of the road." The witch in charge of guarding the caravan cursed in annoyance. With a soft whistle, she once again rode on her oddly shaped broom and flew into the sky. Chapter 613. The entrance to the Farrenbit Wall was placed in an underground hall behind the Witch Council, and was jointly maintained by the Seticilia family and the Pale Witches. As it was nearing the opening day, several other witches had sent their people to Wilming City one after another. The most surprising thing was that the Destiny Witches had also sent their people to participate in the plane invasion. This was the first time since the major witch factions opened their own private secondary planes. Therefore, their arrival was even more eye-catching. When the other witches were still driving the heavy carriages to Wilming City, a huge shadow suddenly flashed over their heads. When the witches of the escort team raised their heads in surprise, they were horrified to see a gigantic floating airship tearing apart countless clouds. It was like a metal castle floating in the sky, crushing down on Wilmingshire City with an imposing aura that could shake one's soul. For a moment, dozens of witches suddenly rose from Wilming City and confronted the floating ship from afar. "Who are you? Don't you know that this is the Northern Witches?" Among the many witches of the Seticilia family, the leading, which had a terrifying grade 3 strength. When she strangely appeared in front of the floating ship, the huge metal warship inexplicably stopped in the air. But before she finished speaking, a familiar figure appeared on the spacious bow of the floating ship. "Lady Aurora, it's me." This voice was low and mellow. Although it wasn't loud, it seemed to have a peculiar charm to it. It actually caused Aurora, a Tier 3 witch, to widen her eyes in surprise. She exclaimed in disbelief, "Alice, it's you?" The dozens of apprentice witches around the Grade 3 witch, wearing the Seticilia family badge on their chests, were all stunned. They silently stared at the beautiful figure that leaned out and nodded at them with a smile. That familiar starry robe, those beautiful and tall eyes, that silk-like smooth white hair, that gentle and firm gaze. It's Alice. It's really Alice, the leader of the Destiny Witches. "Lady Alice, you are—" Witch Aurora could not help but hesitate. Since Alice was on the ship, it meant that they weren't enemies. But such a huge metal warship seemed to have never appeared in any of the witch factions. Why did their actions seem similar to those of the Silver Alliance? While the witch responsible for the safety of Wilning City was bewildered, a faint smile appeared on Alice's pale face. "Alora, this is our ship. We're here to participate in the Pale Witch's Plains opening day." What? Participate in the Plains opening day? For a moment, Herrera could not believe her ears. Ever since the Witch of Fate, Alice, handed over the world waymark of that large plain more than 70 years ago, witches of other factions also opened 1 or 2 private portals to their family's middle plane. They also welcomed witches of other factions to explore and develop the plane together. However, although these middle-grade planes have been colonized by them for hundreds of years, most of them still retained powerful and terrifying native forces. As for these family witches, they could only barely survive in the plane world as a foreign faction. Most of the territories they developed were isolated overseas or in some extremely dangerous and hopeless situation. Using this method, they barely managed to keep a small stronghold and not be expelled by the natives of the plane inside. Even after thousands of years, they still did not complete the large-scale development of the private plane. Instead, they gradually integrated into the plane and became a local force that was half native and half invader. So, taking advantage of this opportunity, most of the witch factions contributed the thorny head plane that they had been developing with difficulty. They provided the portals and temporary footholds, and all the spoils of war obtained by other witch factions after entering would belong to them. Using this method, they could use the strength of other witches to develop a larger territory for their own family. Anyway, the plane would only be open for half a year to a year. Outside witches who did not leave after the time limit could no longer use the portals to get help from the outside world, let alone get supplies from the witch stronghold. Under the strangulation of the powerful native forces of the other plane, such a lone team of witches would sooner or later be reduced to ashes and become flesh and blood sacrifices for others. So, there was no team of outside witches who dared to violate this rule. It was precisely because of the cruelty and bloodshed of the conquest of the other plane that the slightly weaker witch teams would simply be courting death if they entered. So, among the 8 major factions of the Northern Witches, only the Fate faction, because Alice had just been resurrected for less than 100 years, had never sent anyone to participate in the other faction's plane opening day. So when Herrera, who knew the inside story, heard Alice's words, she was so surprised and shocked. Since Lady Alice is here to participate in the Pale Witch's plane opening day, then please park your ship at the 15th Street Square. Alice was obviously quite familiar with Wilning City. She turned her head and gave a simple order. The giant floating ship turned around like a deep-sea giant whale. Surrounded by countless apprentice witches of the Seticilia family, it headed somewhere 3 miles away. When a huge floating ship with a body length of 120 meters and a ship width of 40 meters slowly descended from the sky, the people and vendors of Wilning City on the ground were all inexplicably shocked. They hid far away and silently watched this terrible metal monster. A dull thud was heard. The enormous body of the airship finally landed on the flat and solid 15th Street Plaza, crushing the thick green stones in a powder one by one. One by one, the apprentice witches of the Seticilia family rode on the flying broomsticks, silently floating in the sky around the floating ship. Each of them tightly held the glowing elemental magic wand in their hands. Strangely, the first to appear on the spacious metal platform of the floating ship was not someone else, but a group of short, green-skinned goblins wearing well-ironed leather clothes and trousers and windproof goggles. As soon as they appeared on the ship's platform, they screamed and waved their arms excitedly at the witches in the sky. No one knew what they were shouting. Just when the apprentice witches were puzzled, the cabin door opened again. This time, it was the real northern witches who walked out of the cabin. The 7 Destiny witches followed closely behind the leader Alice. They walked out of the cabin in an orderly manner and came to the position of the bow of the ship. Seeing the witches come out, the goblins did not dare to make any noise. One by one, they hurriedly ran to both sides of the platform, holding a strange glow stick in their hands, and began to operate in command. In the next second, when the cabin door on the side of the floating ship's hull opened, a team of strangely shaped, tall, and mighty metal puppets walked out of the inside with heavy steps. As they walked, the ground of the entire 15th Street Square began to tremble slightly. This was a group of strange and ferocious metal monsters. The armor on their bodies was more than 10 centimeters thick, and their bodies shone with a faint blue luster, which was a unique phenomenon of magical metals. They had a variety of shapes and could be roughly divided into 3 types. The first type was defensive magic equipment with especially thick and solid armor. They held a huge metal tower shield in one hand and a thick chain hammer in the other. As they walked in unison, the dust and gravel on the square's blue stones kept shaking. Even the stone buildings on the periphery of the square began to tremble under the pressure. The second type was some strange magic equipment with slender and light bodies, but their bodies were covered with strange muzzles of various sizes. For some reason, when the apprentice witches saw these black muzzles, they could vaguely feel a suffocating murderous aura. The first 2 types of magic equipment occupied almost 90% of the magic equipment army in front of them. Behind them, 3 more strangely shaped magic equipment with a layer of translucent energy lingering around their bodies walked out of the cabin step by step. The one in the lead was the first genuine magic machine warrior that Grimm had just created after expending a great deal of effort, Mechanical Pioneer Grade 2. It was a new magical mechanical warrior equipped with a blitz perception system, magic ray gun, gravity interferometer, energy heavy cannon, and a small magical furnace as its power source. Grimm did not completely hand over this abnormally powerful magic equipment to Gazravito. Instead, he used the most ancient goblin control method to fight. However, the magic equipment in the past was complicated to operate, and the magic equipment could only perform some simple body movements, so it could not be considered a qualified magic equipment. However, after this mechanical pioneer was equipped with Britz's perception system, the Tier 1 gnome mechanic Tigule could hide within it. He did not need any joysticks or control platforms. He could perfectly control this powerful magic machine with just his consciousness. The remaining 2 magical machine warriors were the improved Goblin Tinkerer and Goblin Warrior. The magic weapons installed on their bodies were not as powerful as the mechanical pioneers, and the core energy source was also a small space furnace, not a small magic furnace. If the Goblin mechanic strength was taken into account, their strength was much weaker than the mechanical pioneers. After a comprehensive analysis and evaluation, these 2 could barely be considered as pseudo-grade 2. Everyone who witnessed the scene could not help but hold their breaths and widen their eyes when they saw 100 battle magical machines equipped with metal constructs lined up in a neat formation on the plaza. Chapter 614. Bringing a bunch of metal puppets to fight in another world? The witches present first gasped, then lowered their heads and snickered. Every witch was well aware of the strength of the metal puppets, which were wrapped in tens of centimeters of high-strength alloy. The 100 metal puppets in front of them were more than enough to flatten a large human city with a population of several hundred thousand. But so what? With so many metal puppets, the amount of magical crystals consumed was also extremely shocking. Using them to fight against the armies of the mortals was indeed invincible. But what about after the battle? Could the broken armor and weapons seized from the battlefield make up for the magical crystals consumed to control the puppets? If they couldn't even make ends meet in every battle, then what was the value of conquering other planes? So in any wizard's pagoda of a northern witch, there would be a large number of steel golems, metal puppets, wizard beasts, and construct creatures. But they could only be placed inside the wizard's pagoda as part of the wizard's pagoda's defense system. They could rarely be placed on the battlefield. Otherwise, just the consumption of magical crystals alone would be a headache. As for organizing them into a terrifying steel army to be used as cannon fodder in war, that was an even more extravagant and wasteful thing to do. So looking at Alice bringing such a huge group of metal puppets to Wilming City, the trainee witches of the Ceticilia family all had a strange expression on their faces. But before the sneers on their faces faded, a few tall figures that had just come out of the cabin attracted their attention. This was a group of foreign wizards and their followers. There were men and women, and there were as many as 12 of them. What surprised the witches of the Ceticilia family was that there seemed to be more level 2 wizards in this group. One had to know that in most wizard families, level 2 wizards were already the core of the family. Unless something big happened, it was rare to see them. Among the group of people in front of them, there were only 6 wizards, but the number of level 2 spells already accounted for half of them. Looking at the tyrannical bodies and wild and domineering aura, all the trainee witches could not help but be secretly shocked, driving their flying broomsticks to fly backward. Alice, what's going on? Why are there so many magi outside? The Aurora, which flew over again and questioned Alice with a frown. After all, Vale would rather be the headquarters of the Northern Witch Council and the place where the leaders of the witches held holy meetings. Usually, they would not allow any wizards other than the Northern Witches to enter this place. Now that the witches had gathered, it was even more impossible to allow the magi outside to wander around. They are all peripheral magi of the Tower of Destiny. This time, they will be following us into the Fairn Plain. Alice pursed her lips into a smile as she explained. Aurora glanced at the group of sorcerers. Sure enough, she could see the scale emblem of the Destiny Witches on their chests. This, Herrera pondered for a moment. Although she knew that there was something wrong, she could not find any loopholes in Alice's words. Almost every witch tower had more or less wizards. Their status was obviously lower than that of witches of the same rank, and they were marginal figures in terms of power. Therefore, it was normal for there to be some wizards in the witches' team. However, in the team in front of her, it was obvious that the peripheral magi were the leaders. The Destiny Witches were more like a supporting cast. Therefore, for Herrera, who had always regarded witches as the highest authority, this was a strange feeling that the sky had turned upside down. But to insist that Alice was at fault, it did not seem to be enough. For a moment, Herrera's expression was strange and complicated. She could only lead Alice and the others to the underground teleportation hall, the Fairn Plain. This was an exceptionally beautiful medium-sized plain. The entire surface area of the plain occupied more than 40% of the surface area. In the vast and boundless ocean, there were many islands and small continents scattered like stars in the sky. Among them, the 2 largest continents were dominated by humans and elves. The 2 continents were separated by a vast ocean, and only large ocean-going ships could travel between them. The Pale Witches had invaded this plain for more than 1,100 years, but unfortunately, they had never been able to gain a stable foothold on the 2 main continents. The Fairn Plain was a top-notch medium-sized plain, with 2 continents and a vast ocean as its foundation. There were already some powerful local gods, and naturally, the 3 main god systems of the sea, humans, and elves were formed. Among them, all the sea creatures, including the ocean empire that ruled the vast territory, believed in the same powerful god, the sea god Dionysus. This sea god Dionysus, according to the Pale Witch's assessment, should be a powerful guy with level 6 strength. And under his command, there was the sea beast god Atri, level 4, and the shallow bay god Sintra, level 3. In addition, there were some small gods with strength of no more than level 2. And in the Callan continent ruled by the Elven Empire, there lived as many as 34 million forest elves. They all believe in a powerful nature god, the elven god Sylvia. Sylvia was also a frightening god with level 5 strength, and under her command were the god of archery Marco, level 4, the god of rangers Eisner, level 4, the god of luck Vicenna, level 3, the forest origin Yurga, level 3, the god of moonlight Mivi, level 3, and many demigods and divine creatures. In comparison, the Farron continent where humans lived was larger, had a larger population, and was richer in resources. However, it was a pity that it did not produce a powerful enough human god. Instead, many lesser human gods were born, such as the god of war Carl, the god of strategy Blake, the god of assassination Kayla, the god of wealth by Ning, the god of justice Dan Fight. Their believers and followers wandered all over the continent, working hard to spread their faith. Thus, it formed an intricate and strange situation where they coexisted with each other. In the Farron continent where humans lived, almost every city or village had multiple religions coexisting at the same time. They fought and ostracized each other, but magically formed a parasitic relationship where they coexisted and thrived together. In this strange and huge world, it was so difficult for the native forces to survive, and the Pale Witches as invaders had an even harder time surviving. More than 1,100 years ago, the Pale Witches locked onto the Farron Plain and broke into this world under the guidance of the great wizards of the Outer Realms. At that time, the Pale Witches invaded the Farron continent under the rule of the elves. Unfortunately, it had been built into a powerful elven empire by the elven gods. The first invasion of the Pale Witches suffered a head-on blow from the elven gods and the elven empire. The two sides fought a bloody battle on the elven continent. The Pale Witches killed as many as 5 elven gods, and although they were all level 2 and 3 gods, they also inflicted heavy losses on the elven gods. Even the level 6 elven god Sylvia was forced to fall into a 1,000-year slumber. On the other side, the Pale Witches also suffered terrible losses. Of the 2 great wizards of the Outer Realms, one was killed and the other was seriously injured, barely came out to repel the attack of the elven gods. The Pale Witches, on the other hand, lost a double-digit number of family wizards and finally had to withdraw from the elven continent, falling to a place called Shadow Island to survive. On Shadow Island, the Pale Witches erected a tall wizard tower, built a cross-plane teleportation circle, and received some military reinforcements from the Sorcerer's World. This was barely enough to defend the first forward camp. In the next 1,000 years or so, every time the Pale Witches accumulated enough strength, they would try to launch an invasion war on the Elven continent or the Farron continent. They used the means of war to plunder villages and cities on the 2 continents in order to seize the resources they needed. After all, the Farron Plain was a top medium-sized plain, and its own strength was large enough. With the strength of the Pale Witches alone, it was difficult to expand the results of the war and seize more land and resources. So when the Witch Council proposed to share some of the resources, the Pale Witches also went with the flow and contributed the Farron Plain. Anyway, the teleportation mark of the plane was in their hands. Using the strength of other witches to open up territory for themselves, why not? As for the resources paid, it was obviously nothing compared to the land and population of the Eternal World. Hence, on this day, the towering Magus Tower on the lonely Shadow Island suddenly lit up with an intense Magus light. Streaks of witchcraft halos stirred the air around the island like a tide, rippling outwards layer by layer. The thick mist that gathered around the Shadow Island all year round was pushed further away by this strange force, and it also allowed the bright sun in the sky to shine on the island-protecting wizard formation of the Shadow Island, which was full of sharp crisscrossed reefs. When the overflowing wizard aura of the wizard tower reached its peak, a huge teleportation gate slowly opened in the center of the Shadow Island. At this moment, Countless pairs of strange eyes around the Shadow Island were silently staring at everything. Due to the existence of the island protecting Wizard Formation and the terrifying Wizard Pagoda, they did not dare to go deep into Shadow Island and could only stay on the surrounding small islands or reefs and wait silently. Ahem, go back and tell the priest that the witches are making a big move again. It seems that another massacre is coming to our fair plain. A strange Murloc spied on everything in the distance, sensing the strong aura of space, and could not help but sigh as he instructed. Chapter 615. For the major forces of the Fair Plain, the isolated Shadow Island was simply a tumor of the plane. These evil witches from another plane occupied the Shadow Island, relying on the geographical advantage and the powerful wizard tower to resist the attacks of the merfolk, elves, and humans for 200 years. In the end, the elves and the humans had to give up this terrible war that almost dragged down the two races, and instead used the method of siege to isolate the witches from the main continent. After hundreds of years of confrontation, even the merfolk had to recognize the existence of the witches, and gave the Shadow Island and the surrounding hundreds of miles of sea to this group of foreign witches, but forbade them from stepping out of the Shadow Island. Therefore, in the next 500 or 600 years, the Shadow Island was simply the most terrible evil place in the Fair Plain. Every year, there would be countless evil people who could not survive in the Elven continent or the Fair Plain, and ran thousands of miles to the Shadow Island to seek refuge with this group of pale witches. This, on the other hand, strengthened the witches' momentum and power. With the help of the contacts and channels brought by these local natives, the pale witches also made contact with many dark forces in the Fair Plain. Therefore, the pale witches provided them with some powerful evil witchcraft equipment, and these dark forces became the witches' peripheral eyes and claws, helping them to search for rare resources all over the continent. Both sides used each other, infiltrated each other, and the pale witches had become the most powerful underground dark force in the Fair Plain. And in these 100 years, every 10 years, the pale witches would choose to open up the Fair Plain. In this way, the northern witches who poured into the Fair Plain naturally became the allies and vanguard of the pale witches. They rushed into the Elven continent and the Fair Plain, looting wealth and resources everywhere, abducting the high elves and the merfolk. So they brought endless pain and disaster to the residents of the two continents. Therefore, the natives of the Fair Plain painfully called this disaster the Witch Disaster. After a long period of struggle, the wise and sages among the humans and the elves gradually found out the rules of the Witch Disaster. Every 10 years, the Witch Disaster would break out, and it would last about half a year or even a year. And during the Witch Disaster, as long as the necessary defenses and preparations were made, it would be possible to minimize the damage and disaster caused by the invading witches. And some of the local forces near the Shadow Island would also join forces to form an anti-evil alliance on the eve of the Witch Disaster and send their respective armies to fight the witches. And this year, it had been a full 10 years since the last Witch Disaster broke out. Due to this reason, all the major forces in the vicinity were on high alert. They used all kinds of methods to send countless spies around Shadow Island, so that they could be the first to know when the Witch Disaster would break out. And the most obvious prelude of the Witch Disaster was the opening of the teleportation portal of the upper plane of the Shadow Island after another quarter of an hour, when the energy sent by the Wizard's Pagoda gradually began to stabilize. The first batch of witches who crossed the teleportation portal slowly appeared. They didn't come alone. Instead, they drove a black carriage, and as if crossing a water gate, they easily passed through the planar teleportation portal from the Magus World's Wilning City to the Shadow Island. The beasts pulling the chariot weren't ordinary horses, but wizard beasts with magical auras. With the wizard barriers supported by the Wizard's Pagoda, the dimension suppression of the Shadow Island was weakened to the lowest level, so the witches who crossed over on the carriages did not show too much of a physiological reaction. Even the servant beasts did not seem to be affected much, and were still jumping around, trying their best to pull the carriages, transporting carts of supplies and resources to the Shadow Island. There were 6 death witches, led by a level 3 witch, and the rest were a level 2 witch and 4 level 1 witches. In addition to the witches, they also brought up to 200 mid-level and high-level undead, including 140 elite ghouls, 20 high-level mummy elders, 5 shadow dwarf assassins, 15 wraith banshees, 5 evil zombie dragons, 5 hardbone dragons, 10 undead knights. These were also the cannon fodder that they had specially prepared for this dimensional war. The Winter Witches sent 5 people, 1 level 2 and 4 level 1. They were transporting 100 frost guards, which were special wizard beasts that were transformed from ice creatures. As for the witches of the other factions, they also sent a sizable wizard beast army. As the teleportation portal continued to absorb and release, the huge teleportation portal almost filled up the huge teleportation portal. Death witches, winter witches, pain witches, pale witches, dark witches, illusory witches, deceiving witches. After the wizard beast army of the 7 great witch factions arrived, a strong light suddenly erupted from within the teleportation portal. This dimensional teleportation portal that was formed by countless wizard runes and law chains seemed to have swallowed a piece of meat that was thicker than its throat, stuck there, unable to swallow or spit it out. The teleportation portal that had been stable just a moment ago immediately rippled, seeming to be shaking. D***, what's going on? Didn't all the witch teams teleport over? Why is there a big guy? Quick, quick, get the wizard's pagoda to expand the space fissure. If we let that be starred over there blow up the dimensional door, the entire teleportation portal will be destroyed. Under the stern urging of the guarding witch, the wizard's pagoda, not far away, trembled slightly, once again increasing the energy supply. As the planar teleportation gate expanded bit by bit, there was a soft pop, and a behemoth-like metal object appeared in front of everyone. What? What is this? This was the first time she had seen such a huge metal object, and the guarding witch was so shocked that she could not even speak properly. Don't get excited. This is a giant airship. It should be a creation of the Silver Alliance. But the Fair Dimension is only open for the Northern Witches. Why would an airship of the Silver Alliance appear here? This time, it was a level 3 pale witch who had appeared. She had a pale face, long silver gray hair, and held a mysterious wizard staff with a strange shape in her hand. The level 3 witch who had led the Witches of Death here clearly knew this pale witch. She shook her head and explained, "Uzel, you've been in the Fair Dimension for too long. I'm afraid you don't know that the Destiny Witches have returned. This airship was brought by them. Don't think that I'm so ignorant. You're talking about that little lass called Alice, aren't you? A Tier 1 brat actually managed to climb to the position of leader of the Fate Witches. Kakik. Sure enough, the Fate Witches are existences that outsiders will never be able to fathom." Uziel couldn't help but laugh strangely as she spoke of her excitement. When the giant airship finally passed through the teleportation portal with difficulty, the giant door of light finally collapsed with a violent tremor. Berserk and disorderly magic currents collided in the teleportation plaza, but they were all blocked by the defensive spell formation that rose up. After a full quarter of an hour, the violent turbulence finally subsided, allowing the people in the teleportation plaza to heave a sigh of relief. "All the witches who have led the teams here, follow me to the 7th floor of the Wizard's Pagoda for a meeting," Witch Uzel called out softly. At this moment, Grim and Alice had just stepped out of the metal cabin of the giant airship. Hearing this, they looked at each other and left the problem of accommodation to others. Only then did they slowly follow the other witches to the powerful wizard tower that stood tall in the center of the Shadow Island. The Shadow Island was an island, isolated in the sea. There was no other volcanic island more suitable for a permanent base within 1,000 miles. The wizard tower stood on the giant crater, using the powerful underground fire energy to provide a large source of energy for the wizard tower. The area of the Shadow Island was not too large, only about 70 square kilometers. Other than the volcanic dust pillars that did not disperse all year round, the outer area of the Shadow Island was also covered by a large amount of water mist. Therefore, most of the time on the island, there was no daylight and the sky was always gray. The pale witches naturally all lived in the tall wizard's pagoda, never having to worry about the harsh environment outside. However, those who came to the Shadow Island to seek refuge with the wicked, which could only build simple wooden houses on the edge of the island and live the life of a fisherman with a pure heart and few desires. The pale witches would not be kind enough to provide them with food and water. If they wanted to survive in this harsh environment, they had to find their own water and food, or steal everything from others. As for the supply ships that came from afar, they could only come once every 2 or 3 months. So in the pigpen-walled city of the Shadow Island, blood and killing became a daily necessity. The meeting was held on the 7th floor of the Wizard's Pagoda. When Grim and Alice followed the witches here, they immediately saw a huge projection of the Fane Plain in the middle of the hall. On the huge Fane continent, the terrain of the continent was winding, with tall and undulating mountains everywhere, some winding for tens of thousands of miles, some rugged and steep, with strange peaks. Human cities, towns, and villages of various sizes were scattered all over the place. Together with the rivers and lakes that were scattered all over the place, it formed a perfect picture of the human world. On the other side of the huge elven continent, there was a dense sea of undulating forests. Looking from afar, it was a huge forest completely overturned by tall ancient trees and countless green plants. Grim immediately scanned the 3D projection of the Fane Plain into the AI chip in a special way, then quickly reconstructed the model and compared it. Chapter 6:16. It was a group of spirits. To be more precise, it was a group of powerful spirits that were associated with the Pale Witches. The reason why the Pale Witches were so powerful was because of these terrifying spirits that were parasitic with their souls. Any enemy who wanted to fight the Pale Witches had to face 2 powerful opponents whose souls were interlinked and of one mind. One had a body of flesh and was proficient in elemental or curse-type spells. The other was a complete spirit that was immune to most physical damage. When the 2 were combined, they formed a complete Pale Witch. It was precisely because of the strength and independent consciousness of the companion spirit that the Pale Witches often regarded each other's companion spirit as themselves. Wherever the spirits went, they enjoyed the same benefits and treatment as their main bodies. And now, walking into the mission hall was actually a group of Pale Witches spirits. It seemed that the witches were busy with other matters, and had left the task of receiving their allies to this group of spirits. There were a total of 5 spirits that entered the hall. 1 was rank 4, 2 were rank 3, and 1 was rank 2. The one who spoke was naturally the rank 4 spirit. This was a beautiful young woman dressed in a gorgeous court dress. If placed in any human noble banquet, she would definitely be the main character of the banquet. Under a light, low-cut skirt were 2 round, creamy mounds of flesh. Her skin was as white and delicate as ivory, and on her exquisite and perfect face were 2 faint blushes. To be honest, if not for the data projected by the AI chip clearly indicating her identity as a spirit, even Grim would have unconsciously treated her as a real human. I am Lilith, the highest ranked witch of the Pale faction stationed in the Fane Plain. First of all, please allow me to welcome all sisters to the Shadow Island of the Fane Plain. There was a burst of warm applause. In order to coordinate the development of the Fane Plain, we, the Pale Witches, have specially formulated a new battle plan. In 7 days, the Shadow Island will be divided into 2 routes to invade the Elven continent and the Fane continent. Although all of you have come to the Fane Plain to collect resources, it is best to move with our team here. It is safer and safer. If any of the sisters wants to move with us, you might as well report the target to me now. I will arrange the specific route accordingly. After listening to Lilith's request, the few witch representatives present could not help but lower their heads and ponder. Callan Continent. The first one to speak was the representative of the Dark Witches. Since someone had spoken up, the other witch representatives did not hide it anymore. Fane Continent, Fane Continent, Fane Continent, Ocean Empire. There were as many as 5 witch factions heading to the Fane Continent. which was less ruled by humans, while only two factions headed to the Callan continent, which was ruled by the elves. However, the most surprising thing was that the hypocritical witches had actually chosen the Ocean Empire. Lilith frowned and pondered for a moment before finally speaking. Since more of our sisters have chosen the Farron continent, then we, the Pale Witches, will also use the Farron continent as the main battlefield for this invasion. The Callan continent will only be responsible for feints. Therefore, the sisters who chose to go to the Callan continent had to bear some unknown risks themselves. In addition, the Ocean Empire has recently signed some friendly agreements with us. So if you hypocritical witches cause any trouble in the Ocean Empire, you will not receive any help from us. Many of the witches were already prepared for such a stance, so they did not raise any objections. Very well, since everyone has accepted this plan, then you can rest and adjust in Shadow Island for the rest of the time and eliminate the effects of the plane suppression as soon as possible. In 7 days, it will be time for us to act together. Also, if you need detailed information and maps of a certain area in the Farron Plain, you can visit Lady Rita. If you want to make some special spiritual weapons, you can visit Witch Uziel. Okay, that's all I need to say. After saying this, the beautiful Lilith left the mission hall without looking back. Grim and Alice discussed for a while, and Alice went to find Lady Rita and bought detailed information about the entire Elven Empire and the Callan continent from her. The price was 30,000 magic crystals. This time, Alice's target was a powerful divine weapon in the hands of the elves. In order to avoid revealing the main purpose of this trip, Alice could only buy all the information vaguely. Prophecy Scepter. This was a low-grade divine weapon that had the powerful power to see through the fate of the world. Anyone who wielded this staff would be able to sense a tiny voice whispering in their ears at all times, as if it was silently telling them the secrets hidden behind the world. But for those who did not have the gift of prophecy, this voice was a terrifying, demonic sound that could drive them crazy. They wanted to hear it, but could not hear it clearly, and could not block it out even if they did not want to hear it. Day and night, all the time. But when this prophecy scepter fell into the hands of the wise and sages, it could reveal the true side of the world that was hidden by the laws of the plane. If Alice wanted to advance to Grade 2, she had to obtain this prophecy scepter and seal it in her card of fate. This was also the only path of survival that had been pointed out to her by 3 consecutive fate divinations. Of course, there were other ways to advance, but with Alice's current vitality, she could not take them. Therefore, even if this path of advancement was filled with difficulties and endless killing intent, Alice could only grit her teeth and walk forward step by step. Before coming here, Alice had only divined that this prophecy scepter was in the Elven continent, but she did not know who had it. Therefore, after analyzing and summarizing the information that she bought, Grim and Alice were a little dumbfounded. If the information that Lady Rita sold them was correct, the prophecy scepter was most likely in the hands of a powerful demigod of the dragon race. In the Farron Plain, a powerful demigod of the dragon race often meant that he was a Grade 2 dragon. There were dragons in the Callan continent ruled by the forest elves. This information was not wrong. It was said that there were about 20 dragons living in the Callan continent, most of which were low-grade green dragons, but there were also a few very powerful emerald dragons. The prophecy scepter that Alice wanted was the collection of a Grade 2 green dragon, Ogo. Although the dragons were naturally arrogant and did not like to live with other races, there were still some special races that had some close ties. The forest elves were natural creatures, and the emerald dragons and green dragons were also dragons that liked nature and lived in the big forest. Therefore, in many planes, these two races naturally had a good impression of each other. In the magic forest ruled by the forest elves, a large piece of forest land was specially designated for the emerald dragons and green dragons to live in. In order to win over these two kinds of dragons, the forest elves specially built tall dragon cliffs and then used countless treasures and mountains of gold coins to decorate the dragon's residence. Therefore, after enjoying a large number of offerings from the forest elves, these dragons were also willing to fight for the elves. Some of the dragons even became excellent partners and friends with the forest elves, which led to the relationship between the two sides becoming closer. After understanding this, Alice painfully discovered that if she wanted to deal with the green dragon named Ogo, she had to include the forest elves. Otherwise, any battle plan would be out of control because of the intervention of the forest elves. However, what troubled Grimm and the others the most was not how to fight, but the lack of local natives who were extremely familiar with the Callan continent. Therefore, Grimm had to turn his attention to the group of evil people living on the Shadow Island. Salted Fish Tavern. It was just dark, but the tavern was already overcrowded. Pushing open the two old, broken double doors at the entrance of the tavern, Grimm had just taken a step forward when he was greeted by the noise and frown. What was even more difficult for him to accept was the hot air, the pungent fragrance of cheap cosmetics, the stench of sweat, and the unique fishy smell of salted fish left for a long time. The living environment that the pale witches provided for these foreign heathens was not very good. There were no solid, comfortable rooms, no fragrant food, no warm water for bathing. They ate bread made from fermented old and rotten wheat and drank poor quality wheat wine. The only meat they ate was fish. Therefore, almost all of the heathens living on the Shadow Island had a strong, fishy smell. When they gathered in the only salted fish tavern on Dark Shadow Island, they were roasted and stirred by the sweaty and heat waves. The pungent and terrible stench was enough to kill an ordinary person who stepped in for the first time. Of course, Grimm was not an ordinary person. With his grade 2 elemental incarnation, he would not die even if he was thrown into the world's most terrifying volcano. Of course, he would not be killed by the stench in front of him. Grimm simply held his breath and stood at the door, casually glancing at the crowd. The place was full of disheveled, ragged vagrants, murderers, and all kinds of criminals. Looking at their races, there were humans, barbarians, dwarves, snake people, and half-elves. The reason why Grimm was sure that they were half-elves was because he had already seen the pair of slender, pointy ears hidden under the tattered felt hats. Grimm's appearance had obviously attracted the attention of all the drinkers in the tavern. All of them maintained the posture they were in just a moment ago. They tilted their heads and stared blankly at this outsider who did not belong to their group. For a moment, they did not know how to react. Although Grimm had put on a thick cloak over his robe, covering all the spirit runes, the cleanliness and tidiness of his body betrayed him, making him look different. We plan to go to the Callan continent in the near future, so we need some guides who are familiar with the local terrain. Do any of you have a suitable candidate? Grimm didn't try to hide his intentions and directly stated his request. ****. Chapter 617. In the end, the one who stood trembling in front of Grimm was the male half-elf. His name was Tomo. According to him, they were born in the Callan continent. His father was a high elf, while his mother was just an ordinary human maid. In the magic forest of the Elven Kingdom on the Callan continent, the high elves were like human nobles, living a life of debauchery and debauchery. The birth of Tamer was just an accident. It was an accident caused by the high elf's master playing with a human maidservant after getting drunk. In the Elven Kingdom, the pure and flawless elven bloodline was very popular. Therefore, in order to purify the family's bloodline, his father, who was a high elf, decided to kill Tomo, who had just been born. However, Tomo's mother, the human maid, did not want her son to die, so she escaped the magic forest under the cover of the night. After wandering the Callan continent for many years, when Tomo had just turned 14, they were once again found by the High Elf's men. After a fierce fight, Tomo's mother, the human maid, clung to the assassin's leg, giving Tomo a chance to jump off the cliff. His mother died under the assassin's sword, and Tomo escaped from the Callan continent with wounds all over his body, becoming a sailor on an ocean ship. In the next 100 years, Tomo wandered around the Fane continent for a long time. In the end, he killed a great noble who tried to kidnap him to be a catamite, and was forced to leave the Fane continent, ending up on the Shadow Island. As a mixed-blood half-elf, Tomo had great balance and agility that ordinary humans could not compare to. His powerful racial talents also allowed him to successfully advance into the thief class, becoming a very famous godly thief. To be honest, Grimm was not interested in the tragic story of the half-elf Tomo at all. The only thing he was interested in was Tomo's hatred and understanding of the Elven Kingdom. Although Tai Mo had lived in the illusory magic forest for more than a decade, all he could remember was the contemptuous, supercilious look and endless hatred. The Elven Kingdom was extremely xenophobic. The entire Elven Kingdom, from the king to the nobles to the lowest level of the Elven Kingdom, were extremely averse to outsiders. Especially towards humans, they had a bone-deep hatred for them. Humans cut down forests and destroyed vegetation. Wherever there were humans, the area of forests would rapidly decrease. Due to the difference in racial concepts, the production and survival methods of humans and most elves were vastly different, which led to all kinds of contradictions and conflicts. After bringing the half-elf back to his residence, Grimm spent another day and night getting more detailed information about the Elven Kingdom from the half-elf. After all, this half-elf Tomo had traveled through most of the areas in the magic forest, and the information he provided was the best supplement and correction to the previous information. The entire Kalan continent was divided into different groups by the forest elves. Those who could live in the core area of the Kalan continent were naturally the noblest and most powerful elven families, while the weaker ones could only live on the edge of the magic forest. That area was adjacent to the coastline, and slave ships from the Fane continent would often dock there and attack some of the weaker elven tribes, bringing the captured forest elves back to the human society and selling them at a high price. Forest elves were all handsome and had delicate and graceful figures. They also had a strong, exotic charm, so they were highly valued in the upper echelons of human society. An ordinary elven girl could be sold for an astonishing 300 to 500 gold coins in the human society. As for the high elves with combat and magic professions, they could be sold for a sky-high price of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. Therefore, living at the edge of the magical forest near the coastline was an extremely dangerous thing to do. Every year, hundreds of slave ships would sneak into the Kalan continent and attack an elven village before quickly retreating. Although most of the slave hunters would fall to the sharp arrows of the elven patrols, there would always be some lucky ones who would be able to pass through the densely packed defense lines of the Elven Kingdom and capture an elven village. All the forest elves, young and old, would be loaded onto ships and taken away. Under such circumstances, the enmity between the elves and the humans grew more and more intense. Now, it had almost reached the point where they would fight each other as soon as they met. After Tomo honestly told him everything he knew, he respectfully asked Grimm, "Lord Wizard, I wonder, where do you want to attack this time?" "Dragon Cliff." Grimm sat by the wooden table and directly answered the half-elf's question, completely ignoring the widened eyes of the half-elf. On Grimm's body, there were two strange dolls the size of a palm, happily climbing up and down. One of them seemed to be made of simple and crude wood, and the inside of it was faintly emitting a creepy green fluorescence. The other was simply a black doll that was messily sewn together. The body was half male and half female, and there was only a single eye drawn with blood on the doll's head. It looked very strange and eerie. The two dolls didn't seem to get along, and they rarely came together. One of them was always lying on Grimm's left shoulder, while the other was floating on Grimm's right shoulder, playing by themselves. The way they played was also very strange. The plague poison spirit's wooden humanoid body did not seem to be a real one. Whenever it saw something it was interested in, it would stretch out its hand, and the wooden arm would instantly turn into countless tiny poisonous insects that were hard to see with the naked eye, wrapping around the item. The plague poison spirit would then determine whether the item was good or bad by putting it in its mouth and biting it. With the highly poisonous power of the plague poison spirit, any ordinary object would be corroded into ashes within a moment, even with a slight touch. Even those low-grade magic tools couldn't resist the corrosive power of this level of poison. As for the newly made puppet, its soul had only just begun to sprout, and it was still a little sluggish. However, When the terrifying bloody eyes turned, the half-elf Tomo, who was standing in front of Grim, froze on the spot in a daze. His soul was almost pulled out of his body. In the end, Grim used his palm to block their line of sight, and Tomo's mind returned to him. The half-elf shuddered, and no longer dared to look around. But in his heart, the terrifying Magus reply was still echoing. Dragon Cliff. Dragon Cliff. The enemy's target was actually Dragon Cliff. As an outsider, he might not understand what Dragon Cliff represented. However, as a half-elf who had lived in the magic forest for more than 10 years, Tomo was very familiar with the importance of Dragon Cliff to the forest elves. Because Longyear represented the strongest and most terrifying ultimate power of the Elven Kingdom. Out of hatred towards his father and the entire forest elves, Tomo immediately knelt in front of Grim without hesitation and vowed to do his best to help the wizards accomplish this feat. Grim was satisfied and allowed him to join the team. 7 days passed in the blink of an eye. After replenishing and recuperating on the Shadow Island, the majestic expedition fleet raised their sails, and according to the plan, they split up to attack 2 distant continents tens of thousands of miles away. And this time, the Witches of Destiny led by Alice had once again become particularly eye-catching. The huge airship that was filled with all the goods, resources, and magical equipment quickly rose into the sky and quietly hid in the thick clouds under everyone's gazes. The Dark Witches, who did not have a good relationship with the Destiny Witches, could only take the giant ship provided by the Shadow Island, and together with the Pale Witches, they traveled through the starry night towards the Kalan continent. A huge amount of magical energy surged inside the giant floating ship and turned into a powerful force of wind, carrying the 10,000-ton all-metal giant ship silently across the sky. The terrifyingly powerful elemental airflow shattered the surrounding clouds, leaving behind a strange cloud path that looked like broken cotton. Through the gaps between the constantly flashing clouds, one could clearly see the azure sea rapidly passing by under their feet. Amidst the flickering light and passing shadows, 1 or 2 small islands filled with lush greenery could occasionally be seen, and one could also see cheerful seabirds circling above the islands. Unfortunately, before they could take a closer look, the scene in front of them would be left far behind, never to be seen again. Closing his eyes and feeling the magical aura of this mysterious world, as well as the strange laws of the plane that were different from the sorcerer world, Grim's mood was unprecedentedly relaxed and comfortable. Although they had embarked on an incomparably dangerous journey, and although what awaited them was a bloody and cruel battle, for some reason, Grim had great confidence in this journey. This was not arrogance, nor was it a prediction, but a kind of trust in himself and the team. After the influence and practice in the Lance Plain, the Magic Cattle's army had basically taken shape, and a Magic Cattle's army that he had painstakingly built was ready to go. Moreover, he had a few mysterious trump cards in his hands. Although this trip to the Kalan continent was dangerous, Grim was still confident that Alice could achieve her wish. Isn't it just a prophecy scepter? Isn't it just a powerful Grade 2 green dragon? Isn't it just a group of weak elves with the protection of a powerful god? So what? At this moment, in Grim's heart, all his enemies were paper tigers. What he needed to do was to find the enemy's weak point that could be easily broken. Chapter 6:18. The Kalan Continent. As one of the only 2 large continents in the Farron Plain, the Kalan Continent was also a beautiful world with rich resources and many creatures. As far as the eye could see, the entire Kalan Continent was covered in lush, dense forests. The ancient trees in the forest were tall and strong, easily dozens of meters high, and the huge canopies that stretched out were often acres in size. The branches and leaves of the ancient trees danced, and the vines coiled around them. All kinds of colorful and unknown birds stood on the branches and sang happily. The lush ferns and shrubs under the tree filled the quiet and dark woodland to the brim, making it difficult to find a place to rest. Ordinary people could hardly move an inch in such a magical forest. This was a remote area near the coastline of the Callan continent. Only here did the tall, ancient trees seem a little sparse. Even their heights were much shorter than the ones in the mainland. At the edge of the coastline, there were steep cliffs and large reefs everywhere. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks and washing against the shore was deafening, making people feel excited every time they heard it. The undulating waves on the surface of the sea sparkled. The blue sea, the blue sky, the green water, in addition to the boundless sea of trees, as well as the cries of apes and the roars of tigers that rang out from the forest from time to time, the beautiful natural scenery was pregnant with vigorous vitality and hope. However, at this time, a few black dots suddenly appeared in the depths of the forest. They stuck close to the undulating treetops and quickly approached from afar, arriving at this coastline. This was a team of silver Pegasus knights, unique to the Elven Kingdom. The Elven Knight was riding on a tall steed that was covered in a thin layer of soft silver armor and had a pair of wide wings on its back. The silver Pegasus, like its name, shone with silver light and could be clearly seen from dozens of miles away. It had 4 broad hooves, a long, silver-dyed horse mane, a strong and vigorous body, and a pair of wide wings that could freely soar in the blue sky while riding the wind. This kind of Pegasus was a magical beast born in the depths of the magic forest near a special magic spring. It had the appearance of a horse, the speed of an eagle, and the noble and elegant temperament of a unicorn. Therefore, the forest elves deliberately domesticated this magical beast and used it as the mounts of some high-grade knights, forming the most eye-catching flying force in the Elven Kingdom, Silver Lightning. They may not be as fierce as griffins, nor as powerful as hippogriffs, but they had the fastest flying speed in the Callan continent and the most eye-catching appearance. Well, the eye-catching appearance may not help in combat, but the Silver Pegasus Knights were still voted as the most popular combat profession among the elven girls in the Elven Kingdom. Almost no elven girl could refuse the invitation of the Silver Pegasus Knights to stroll in the forest and admire the scenery. Therefore, from all aspects, the Silver Pegasus Knights were the most elite troops of the Elven Royal Court. They were also the most favored and symbolic troops. Usually, the Silver Pegasus Knights and their reserve Pegasus Knights would only patrol near the Elven Kingdom. Pegasus Knights would only patrol near the Elven Kingdom. Their appearance here today meant that an important member of the royal family must have stayed nearby. Pegasus. There were 2 Silver Pegasus Knights and 3 reserve Pegasus Knights. When the Silver Pegasus Knights flew to the edge of the forest and were 3 meters away from the treetops, the leading Silver Pegasus Knight gently pressed on the back of the horse and jumped off. In order to reduce the burden of riding the Silver Pegasus, the Silver Pegasus Knights usually only wore some light silver soft armor and carried light weapons. They also carried a small number of javelins and a large number of arrows in the leather pouch on the back of the horse. At this time, the Silver Pegasus Knight didn't slow down. With a flap of its wings, it stepped on its 4 hooves and rushed into the sky, while the Silver Pegasus Knight gently fell down. This Silver Pegasus Knight clearly had the world's lightest and most agile body. His strong body stepped on a thick branch, and with a slight crouch, he leaped up, then gently somersaulted a few times in the air and landed steadily on the high cliff at the edge of the coastline. "Hergus, wait for me." The other Silver Pegasus Knight, who came with him, obviously didn't have such an agile body and soft body movements. He could only pat the Silver Pegasus beneath him twice, circling in the sky before flapping his wings to slow down and hover above the high cliff. Only then did the Silver Pegasus Knight cautiously jump onto the high cliff. Landing a little heavily, his silver leather boots stepped on the edge of the high cliff. Immediately, countless gravel tumbled down the cliff and fell into the foamy waves and reefs. Sidaris, who was on duty for the first time, unwittingly broke out in a cold sweat. He patted his chest a few times to steady his breathing before he strode to Higa's side. At this time, the Silver Pegasus Knight, who jumped first, had already pulled out a monocular that glowed with silver light and began to silently scan the distant sea surface. Hergus, you're so brave. You dare to jump down from such a high place. Aren't you afraid of falling into the sea and becoming food for the fishes? While ridiculing his companion to his heart's content, Cadaris stuck his head out to look at the undulating waves and the dark, terrifying reefs below the cliff. Once again, he secretly patted his chest. With such a height and such dense reefs, he would definitely be smashed to pieces if he fell. Having lost the knight's control, the two silver Pegasus happily chased each other on the nearby treetops, while the other three Pegasus knights rode on their recently tamed Pegasus and found an empty space nearby to descend. They silently waited for the two Sir Knights' orders. As the noble silver Pegasus knights of the elven race, be it Cadaris or Hergus, they were both classic, good-looking men. Their figures were tall and strong, with solid muscles and rosy skin. They had long grass-green hair, soft pointed ears, and a pair of blue eyes. They wore light silver soft armor and skirt armor of the same color. On their feet were a pair of silver leather boots, and on their waists hung two silver scimitars. Cadaris' skin was slightly fair, and his exquisite and perfect face carried a hint of childishness. His eyes were bright and twinkling, and he had an unforgettable, lively aura. Although Hergus was equally handsome, his face was slightly stiff, and his every movement carried a trace of the coldness and capability of an iron-blooded soldier. Cadaris muttered a few more words in a low voice, but did not get a response from his companion. He could not help but ask, loudly out of curiosity, "What's wrong, Hergus? There's no sea fog today, and you can see everything on the sea with a glance. Why are you still strenuously looking? Are you worried about those human slave ships?" Hergus silently put down the telescope and said solemnly in a deep voice, "I'm not worried about the humans, but those witches." Hearing his companion's reply, Cadaris blinked, not fully understanding. "I heard that too. It's time for the witch calamity to break out again. I'm afraid those witches will come from far away to harass us again. But the last few times have been much better. Those witches seem to know how powerful we are, and have invested most of their strength in the humans. Our losses these few times aren't that great." Compared to Cadaris' nonchalant attitude, Hergus was a little worried. "Cadaris, you don't know." Hergus hesitated for a moment, and finally said through gritted teeth, "I went to find Priestess Tia a few days ago." The moment he heard the name, Tia, Cadaris immediately became nervous. He growled in a low voice, "You're crazy? How dare you come into contact with that crazy woman? Don't you know that people are calling her a black witch behind her back? It's said that the Elder Council is about to vote to expel Tia from the illusory forest. Are you trying to get in touch with her now?" Calm down, calm down. Let me finish." Hergus sighed. "I don't think Priestess Tia did anything wrong." "What did she do wrong? She's a subject of Silsa, and yet she went to study the power of those witches. Isn't that a huge mistake?" "But those hateful witches have been in our world for thousands of years, and have we ever driven them out? No, not in the past, not now, and probably not in the future. Why? It's because they have magic that is far more powerful than ours, and it's the strange magic they call witchcraft." Hergus took a deep breath. If it's really as Priestess Tia envisioned, and Silsa's people can learn those powerful witchcraft, we forest elves might really be able to become the rulers of Faern. Leyland muttered. Hearing Hergus's explanation, Cadaris could not help but shake his head. "Hergus, I think you've been bewitched by Priestess Tia as well. Don't believe her words. There's no good or evil in power, or it all depends on who controls the power. Don't believe her, Hergus. I feel that there are good and evil powers in this world. Witches may be powerful, but they can bewitch and corrupt people's hearts. Otherwise, how could they have done so many evil and terrifying things?" Hergus was silent for a long time before he finally spoke again. "Don't you want to hear what Priestess Tia learned after studying the books left behind by the dead witches for so long?" Listening to Hergus's heavy tone, Cadaris had an ominous premonition. "What did she tell you?" "She said that the witches who invaded our world were only a branch of a large force in the sorcerer world. The witch calamity that has been happening more and more frequently in recent years probably means that the forces of the witches have changed, and more witches have entered our world. Cadaris could not help but swallow his saliva with difficulty, and asked anxiously, "So what does this mean?" "It means that our world has become the main target of the other party, and that there will be even more terrifying and evil enemies in this year's witch calamity." Blood moon. Tia said she saw the blood moon. Towards the end, her Gus was almost roaring as he grabbed his companion's shoulders. Blood moon. Chapter 619. Somewhere on the west coast of the Callan continent. The giant floating ship flew above the clouds at an extremely low speed. A few wizards belonging to the Crimson family walked onto the deck and leaned against the side of the ship, silently looking down at the magical continent that was faintly discernible below them. With their strength and the buff of the Eagle Eye spell, they could easily see through the thin layer of clouds and directly observe the strange natural landscape and the various types of jungle creatures in the Callan continent. Unfortunately, it was not as easy to find elves as it was to find humans. Humans like to cut down trees near settlements to build tall and sturdy camps and buildings. Therefore, at night, as long as they followed the lights, they would naturally be able to find human villages and towns. However, the elves were known to be the closest to nature and the race that loved the forest the most. They almost never cut down trees, and instead, they naturally built their villages and towns on especially tall and thick ancient trees. Tree houses were the elves' living quarters. When night fell, the elves would rarely light open fires. Moreover, they lived deep in the mountains and forests, so it was almost impossible to find them with candlelight. On the other hand, people like Grimm and the others were flying high in the blue sky. Looking into the distance, all they could see was lush greenery. It was difficult to find a single color in the sea of undulating trees. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to find an elven village with just the naked eye. Therefore, if they wanted to find elves here, they could only go into the forest and jump high and low like the elves. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Tamo, can you recognize the terrain here? Before we start the war with the elven court, I hope we can hide this giant floating ship. Can you recommend a place? Grimm simply swept his gaze across the lush green forest and asked the half-elf guide. Of course, Grimm could not completely trust this guy who had joined them halfway. While waiting for an answer, Grimm silently called out the topographic map of the Callan continent in his mind and compared it with the long, broken coastline in front of him. It seemed like it had been a long time since he last smelled the magic power in the magic forest. The half-elf Taimaw suppressed his excitement as he laid on the side of the floating warship and observed the forest beneath him. If I remember correctly, this should be the White Cliff, which is slightly south of the west coast. The most obvious sign here is the white cliff rock that stands tall at the edge of the coast. Following Tamo's finger, Grimm saw a patch of white at the edge of the cliff. This is the area with the most complicated sea conditions near the west coast. The reefs are the densest, and it's also the most unsuitable area for large ships. Therefore, in this area, the probability of us running into the Elven King's patrol is extremely low. Tamo then pointed in a certain direction. Head in that direction, and you'll find an elven village in about 7 days. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the time needed to travel through the forest. As for riding on this big thing, it'll only take half a day. An elven village? Grimm muttered to himself for a moment before shaking his head. It's not suitable for us to come into contact with the elves so early. We need to find a suitable place to settle down first. Tamo, are there any large metal veins or mines in the west coast? Metal veins? Tamo's jaw dropped in surprise. There are quite a few in the central part of the magic forest, but on the west coast. The half-elf lowered his head and pondered for a moment before gesturing with uncertainty. It's about 16 days' journey to the north from here. There seems to be a rat folk mine there, but I don't know if there are any metal veins there. Then let's go there first. Grimm immediately gave the order. A moment later, the floating warship ascended once more and dove into the clouds. It followed the direction that the half-elf had pointed out and quickly flew north along the coastline. When the gigantic floating warship completely disappeared, two elves drilled out from the lush crown of a tall ancient tree at the edge of the forest. They were wearing clothes woven from green vines. The two elves, one male and one female, stared at the spot where the metal monster had disappeared. Their eyes were filled with unconcealable shock. What was that? Was it another monster created by the witches? The female elf's voice was trembling. It was obvious that she had not yet recovered from shock. It doesn't matter what it was. We have to send the news of the metal monster back to the village as soon as possible. Maybe Grandpa Wenger can tell us the answer. The male elf made a prompt decision. All right, let's go. In the blink of an eye, the two elves disappeared into the crown of the tree behind them. Strangely enough, in the blink of an eye, they had blended into the forest, making it difficult for anyone to track them. A day later, the news about the appearance of a terrifying metal monster spread to every elven village on the west coast. The rat folk mine. Tomo's 16-day journey was only a day and a night for the floating warship. If it wasn't for the fact that it took them 4 hours to locate the mine's entrance, Grim and the rest would have arrived much sooner. As the name suggested, the rat folk mine was hidden in a dense forest. There was only a dark, slanted entrance to the mine, and a large tribe of rat folk lived in it. The elves were a tribe that paid great attention to their appearance and cleanliness. It was impossible for them to work in a dark and damp mine that never saw the light of day. Therefore, the forest elves and the rat folk in the mine reached an agreement. The rat folk would hand over a certain amount of, or to the forest elves every year in exchange for the right to live in the mine. Therefore, not a single elf could be found in the rat folk mine. The only ones living in the mine were intelligent rat folk that were less than a meter tall. They could walk upright like humans, and they could use all kinds of sophisticated tools. These rat men were too skinny to wear heavy armor, so they could only wear a metal cap on their heads. Then, they lit a thick candle on top of the cap, and used the dim light to move about freely in the dark and damp mine. The weapons of the rat folk miners were pickaxes. Some of the stronger rat folk warriors were equipped with powerful weapons such as machetes, iron swords, and spears. Based on Tomo's description, Grim could tell that the most powerful Ratman leader was only a grade, 1 Ratman. The rest of the Ratman warriors and miners were either high-grade apprentices or quasi-sorcerers. They didn't have any elemental power and only knew how to scheme and scheme. Grim didn't want to send his precious wizard to deal with such trash. He only sent a goblin technician and 5 archer magic machines to break into the mine. Grim and the rest found a slightly flat area outside the mine and set up tables and chairs. After drinking 2 cups of hot tea, the battle in the mine was over. Almost 200 rat folk, including the Rat King, were killed in one fell swoop. They were shot full of holes by the metal bullets of the magic machines. As for the metal crossbow bolts shot by the rat man hiding in the dark tunnel, no matter if it was strength or attack power, it was not enough to harm the thick metal shell of the magic machine. Hence, after being suppressed, the archer magic machines easily slaughtered the entire group of rat folk. The goblin technician brought back 4 or 5 ores that were mined from the depths of the mine. Grim casually picked up one of the ores and weighed it in his hand. He then raised it to his eyes to examine it. Beep. This is an ordinary ore. It contains 11% of the mineral content. The rest is useless waste. The mineral content is as follows: luo, iron, or 1, 42%. Olivine, or 3, 27%. Pyroxene, or 2, 86%. Metal content is less than XXX%. Not worth mining or smelting. The AI chip gave a final evaluation after a long list of the mineral's composition. The quality of the rat folks' mine was not high. Most of what they offered to the elves were topaz, olivine, agate, and other low-grade magic materials. These things were of some value to the elves, but they were useless to Grim, who was eager to establish his foundation. After inspecting the ores brought out by the gnome technician, Grim waved his hand in disappointment. Everyone boarded the floating warship again. The The warship turned around and flew at high speed towards another mysterious mine in the distance. It could be said that in order to find a suitable metal vein as soon as possible, Grimm was willing to do anything. After all, this was the border of the great magic forest. The Elven Kingdom could only send a limited number of troops here, and it was not enough to stop them. In another 5 or 6 days, the Dark Witches and Ashen Witches Alliance would arrive at the Callan continent. At that time, they would become even more eye-catching and easy targets. At that time, the Elven Kingdom would be more willing to send their elite troops to encircle them, and would not bring a group of elven troops to chase after the giant floating ship. In truth, with the sturdy ship and giant cannons, Grimm no longer cared about the armies of the secular world. The only ones he was wary of were the elemental users and the powerful elves. Chapter 620. The Valley of Spears was unusually peaceful in the afternoon. Birds were singing and insects were chirping in the dark forest. A flock of brightly colored spotted birds were spreading their beautiful wings and flying happily among the branches. Mottled light shone through the gaps between the leaves, leaving a dazzling pillar of light in the air. Unfortunately, not only did the pillar of light not illuminate the forest, but also made the Valley of Spears even more serene and deep. The Valley of Spears was a long, narrow, and sunken ravine. It got its name because it was shaped like a spear. In the deepest part of the Valley of Spears, there was an underground mine opened up by the kobolds. It was famous for producing high-quality iron ores. Strictly speaking, this was one of the restricted military zones designated by the Elven Kingdom. Apart from the Elven convoys and kobold miners, no other races were allowed to approach or enter. Usually, the kobold's mine was too dark and deep, and it would collapse at any moment. That was why other creatures and beasts weren't willing to enter. Therefore, the kobold's defense was unusually lax. 2 kobold warriors could be seen with a naked eye in front of the huge, dark cave entrance. They were hugging their spears, leaning against the wall and dozing off. The towering cliffs on both sides of the Valley of Spears were still densely covered with tall, ancient trees. Their leafy canopies blocked the bright sun hanging high in the sky, leaving only a path of sunlight in the middle of the valley. However, in this tranquility, in the shadow of a tall, ancient tree above the valley, a female elf wearing exquisite armor flung off her cloak and emerged from her camouflage. "Zack, will that metal monster really come to this desolate place to plunder? There's nothing in the kobold's mine except iron ores. Why would the witches want these metal lumps?" The female elf flipped her short green hair anxiously and turned to look at the ancient tree beside her. And at the place where the female elf was staring, the wrinkled and cracked bark of the tall, ancient tree strangely protruded into a human shape. Then it transformed into a male elf wearing green vine clothing, a deer helmet on his head, and an oak staff in his hand. He had thick eyebrows, big eyes, a straight nose, and a wide mouth. His green hair was twisted into thick braids that draped over his shoulders. Although he wasn't handsome, he had a wild and straightforward beauty to him. From its appearance, it could be seen that this was a special profession among the forest elves, a druid. According to the characteristics of the class, the druids were more of a combination of warriors and spellcasters. They possessed powerful nature spells. Not only could they cast spells, but they could also transform into a real magical beast at any time, using their powerful racial abilities and physical strength to fight against their enemies. However, most of the targets that druids could choose to transform into were wild magical beasts of the nature element, and they were unable to transform into another world. This druid named Isaac was also a Type 2 expert. He had come from the Central Mountain Range to stop the metal beast. However, due to the lack of time, the druid order that he brought with him was not complete. It was only a third of his regular army. Even so, a team of 40 druids was a force to be reckoned with no matter which region they were in. Before I came, Commander Molina had already told me that we must figure out the enemy's strength and movements. The general staff has analyzed the enemy's movements and found that they seem to be coming for the mines in Callan Continent. Along the way, they have already looted 4 wild mines. According to their last location and flight path, this cobalt mine is very likely to be their target. If the general staff is so sure, why do they only send you here? Where's the blade of glory? Where's the nature's wrath archers? Where's the silver lightning? Where are they? It was no wonder that the female elf was so angry. At the end of the day, she was only a level 2 guard captain of a nearby elven town. She only had 100 or so warriors under her command, most of which were flower elves and sword dancers. Less than half of them were elite, level 1. Even though all the druids that Isaac brought with him were elite, there were only about 60 elite warriors in total. The female elf captain was a little nervous about ambushing the metal monster and the witch riding on it with such a force. There's nothing we can do about it. The druid Isaac shook his head. It's urgent. We've received accurate news that a large number of witch warships are approaching the east coast. The elite troops of the kingdom have been transferred to Silver Moon City in the east. The commander is worried that the metal beast is just a bait sent by the enemy to distract our forces. Otherwise, why haven't they attacked any elven towns yet? So before we figure out its basic strength, only the few of us can come here quickly. Then we should at least send the silver lightning or the hippogriffs here. They can fly in the sky. If we don't have enough air power, how are we going to fight them? The female elf captain was still angry. The troops you mentioned have been transferred to the east coast to investigate the enemy's movements. They won't be able to make the long journey back in a short time. If the enemy really ambushes them and lands the metal airship, we'll find a way to rush up and occupy it. The druids I brought with me have all advanced and can transform into wind eagles. They also have a certain level of aerial combat ability. If the enemy has any aerial troops, leave them to us. But if necessary, we may need your long-range attacks as support. Hearing this, the female elf captain nodded silently. There were 20 elven archers in the garrison that she brought. Although they weren't as strong as the advanced godly archers, they had no problem in assisting with mid-range and close-range shooting. The only headache now was that they didn't know what kind of enemy was on the flying airship. What was more troublesome was that they were flying high in the sky and could choose any target to attack at will. Before they could confirm the enemy's target, the elves could only passively defend and be on guard. They couldn't gather their forces to fight effectively. Just like now, the female elf captain had to quietly hide here and wait for the possible enemy. On the other hand, she was worried about the Moon Shadow village that was 80 miles away. That was her hometown and also the place where she was born and raised. Now, the entire garrison of the village had been transferred here. What if? The female elf captain shook her head, trying hard to get rid of the terrifying thought in her mind. She pushed aside the luxuriant leaves in front of her again and began to scan the azure sky in the west. Suddenly, the female elf captain's body trembled. She let go of the leaves and squeezed her body deeper into the canopy. Her blue eyes stared unblinkingly at the black that was gradually getting bigger in the west. Not daring to delay, the female elf captain raised her hands and cupped them around her mouth, shouting at the nearby forest with all her might. Amidst the rustling of the leaves in the forest, outsiders would only ignore such high-frequency shouts as background noises. Only natural creatures like the forest elves, druids, and flower elves would be able to decipher the long and obscure shouts. The enemy is really here, and they're heading straight for the cobalt mine. Upon receiving the female elf captain's order, all the elven warriors hiding in the dense forest on both sides of the Valley of Spears hid themselves. They pricked up their ears and silently waited for the next battle order. The female elf captain took a step back and lightly shook the elven cloak on her body, completely covering her armor and body. With a strange change of light and shadow, her figure perfectly merged into the surrounding environment and could no longer be distinguished. At the same time, the Grade 2 druid named Isaac had already used a camouflage spell to merge into one with the ancient tree. Unless the enemy happened to touch his body, no one would be able to find him by scanning his position. The floating warship glided across the sky at high speed. From afar, Tomo discovered the Valley of Spears that had a rather peculiar appearance. Under his command, the floating airship ejected dense wind, elemental particles, and slowly hovered above the Kobold men's mine. The terrain of the Valley of Spears was too long and narrow for the floating warship to land. So, standing at the bow of the warship, Grim looked down and waved his hand to signal the warship to lower its altitude. Hence, under a gust of wind, elemental particles, the floating warship began to descend along the center line of the Valley of Spears. Soon, it reached the same height as the rocky cliffs on both sides. At this moment, the dense treetops of the tall, ancient trees on the cliffs brushed against the body of the floating warship, producing ear-piercing sounds of friction and snapping. The two kobold warriors guarding the entrance of the mine had long been awakened. Seeing the huge warship pressing down on them, they threw their spears away and barked as they fled into the mine. A dull thud sounded. The bottom of the floating warship touched the cliff, and the entire body of the warship trembled before finally coming to a stop. At this moment, the ancient trees on both sides of the cliff clustered around the warship, wrapping it tightly like swaddling a baby. At this moment, a small team of 10 came out of the inner cabin of the floating warship. 2 goblin technicians led 8 archer magic machines. On the deck of the warship, apart from the half-elf Tomo, there were only Grim, Bliss, and 2 destiny witches who came out to watch the fun. This was the first time they came to such a beautiful foreign world, and the 2 young witches who had never traveled far before were unusually excited. They had already decided to go to the nearby forest for a walk. In such a strange place, they might be able to find some rare plant specimens that could not be found in the sorcerer world. They might be able to get a lot of magic crystals back in the sorcerer world. However, just as Grim was about to order the exploration team to descend, the expressions of the 2 witches who walked to the edge of the ship suddenly changed, and they shouted, "Enemy attack!" At this moment, the sound of arrows piercing through the air came from the sky. Chapter 6:21. Enemy Attack. Loud shouts resounded through the sky. Grim's expression instantly changed. The first wave of attack was not concentrated, with only 100 or so arrows at most. However, what was even more frightening was that these arrows were all enchanted feathered arrows. Asterisk, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Asterisk, hundreds of enchanted arrows landed on the giant airship amidst ear-piercing screeches. The elves hiding in the dark were also very cunning. They actually let go of the 10 metallic battle magic machines and aimed their arrows at the wizards in cloth robes. Unexpected, truly unexpected. Ever since they entered the Callan continent, their journey had been smooth sailing. Coupled with the fact that they had never had any direct conflict with the elves, Grim had unknowingly let his guard down. He did not expect to be ambushed on such a large scale in the wilderness where elves could not be seen. Furthermore, they were being attacked by enchanted arrows. Asterisk, the sound of arrows piercing into flesh could be heard continuously. Grim and the other 3 were pierced by a dense number of arrows. The violent force of nature instantly tore their cloth robes into pieces. The 4 of them were in great pain, and their mouths were filled with blood. The 2 witches howled in pain and fell to the ground. Grim roared towards the sky, and his body instantly spewed out boiling lava and high-temperature flames that could corrode bones and corrode flesh. The enchanted arrows stuck in his body were roasted red in an instant, then softened into molten iron and flowed down. Grim had already completed the elemental transformation of his body and mind. Although this external attack made him feel very uncomfortable, it was still not enough to kill him. Furthermore, the insect Lich Bliss was a monster that was difficult to kill with physical attacks. If not for the strange force of nature in the arrows of the elves, they would not even be able to cause a slight injury to Bliss. Hence, after withstanding the impact of the force of nature, the insect Lich Bliss stood up straight once more. He did not care about the densely packed arrows on his body at all. Instead, he stared with his ferocious compound eyes, His gaze locked onto the agile figures that were stepping on ancient tree branches and leaping towards the giant floating ship. Grim and Bliss were not seriously injured, but the two witches were completely different. They were obviously rookies who had just advanced not too long ago, and naturally did not have the terrifying life-saving methods that Bliss had. Amidst the dense rain of arrows, one of them had died while the other was heavily injured, and it could be said to be extremely tragic. Although one of the witches had been shot like a porcupine, her vitals had not been hit, so she was only seriously injured but not dead. The other witch, on the other hand, was not so lucky. Her body was full of arrows, but the most fatal one was the arrow that pierced through her forehead. Damn it! Damn it! Damn it! Grim couldn't help but roar furiously as he sensed a witch's life force rapidly slipping away. At this time, the enemy's second wave of arrows arrived. Kill them for me. Grim roared furiously. Amidst his earth-shattering roar, the insect, Lich Bliss, laughed coldly. His body suddenly exploded, turning into an uncountable swarm of black insects that charged towards the first batch of enemies. Although Grim wanted to rush forward and crush a few enemies to vent his anger, he could only force himself to calm down. He pointed at the dying witch on the ground and cast a flame shield on her. One had already died, and the heavily injured one could not die as well. Otherwise, it would be a huge loss. It had to be said that the main reason the elves' first wave of arrows could cause so much damage to the Magi was that the Magi were not prepared for it. Magi, in essence, were just a bunch of humans with powerful abilities. Without the protection of witchcraft, an arrow that hit a vital point could take away a wizard's life. However, once the Magi were vigilant and wrapped themselves in the protection of defensive spells, it would not be easy for the elves to kill them with long-range attacks. At least, the elves currently did not have the ability to kill an official magus with a single arrow. The second volley of arrows arrived once more. This time, they were destined to return empty-handed. The heavily injured witch on the ground had 3 flame shields around her. Although they trembled from the arrows, enchanted with the power of nature, they did not shatter. As for the arrows that were shot at Grim, they quickly softened after entering his flame barrier, and then smashed into pieces on his suddenly expanding body. The enraged Grim immediately turned into a terrifying flame demon and strode towards the heavily injured witch, shielding her with his body. At this moment, Bliss, who had turned into a swarm of black insects, had already clashed with the first wave of enemies and started fighting fiercely. This wave of enemies were all bare-chested, wearing only a pair of tight leather pants. Their bodies were covered with strange magic runes, sword dancers. Sword dancers were a special profession for elven warriors. They could not wear armor and could only wear leather or cloth armor, so they were considered to be low armor or unarmored warriors. They wielded 2 long, narrow elven swords, and their bodies were covered with the unique runes of the sword dancers. These runes could increase their agility and reaction speed, but most of them had a strange ability to confuse the enemy's senses. When the sword dancers brandished their swords and charged into the enemy's formation, their flashing bodies and elven runes could deceive the enemy's vision, causing them to be unable to pinpoint the exact position of the sword dancers and their hand gestures. The sword dancers had almost no defensive abilities and relied entirely on their high agility and nimble body movements to dodge the enemy's attacks, dealing a swift blow to the enemy when their swords clashed. The minimum requirement to advance to become a sword dancer was to stay in a dark room with 10 swinging metal balls full of sharp metal spikes hanging from the ceiling for a quarter of an hour. Hence, the most powerful ability of the sword dancers was their ability to dodge attacks. Unfortunately, this ability was useless against the insect lich, Bliss. Without the protection of thick armor, the sword dancer could not stop the millions of insects from biting at him. Hence, the huge swarm of insects that gathered and dispersed were like tigers in a pack of wolves, completely ignoring the blades in the sword dancer's hands as they swarmed and crawled over his body. In just a few seconds, when the swarm of insects suddenly flew away, There was only a corpse that was completely green and had been bitten beyond recognition. Bliss's efficiency in killing was not high, but his pounces were accurate. In the blink of an eye, 7 of the 30 sword dancers on the deck of the floating airship had fallen. As for the sorrowful and indignant sword dancers, no matter how they swung their sabers, they were unable to stop the black insects from penetrating through. These damn magi, sword dancers, spread out and leave this fellow to the druids. You guys go kill that fire person and the witch. A nimble female elf leapt onto the side of the airship and looked down at the battlefield, shouting out commands. As she roared, she quickly drew her bow and shot 2 arrows at the swarm of black insects. Unlike before, these 2 arrows were as fast as shooting stars, exploding into 2 huge fireballs the moment they came into contact with the black beetles. Many of the insects that the sword dancers had failed to surround were blasted to death by the fireballs, and insect corpses fell to the ground. The black insects shrieked and flew tens of meters away in an instant, condensing into Bliss's appearance in the air. However, compared to before, his body seemed to have shrunk a little, and he did not look as bloated as before. Bliss roared angrily at the female elf, and 14 peculiar scorpions crawled out of his body. These scorpions were only the size of a fingernail at first, but when they left Bliss's body, they immediately swelled to the size of bulls and crawled towards the female elf on the metal deck. However, before Bliss could retaliate against the female elf, tens of oddly dressed elves jumped onto the airship and roared as they charged at him. Halfway through their charge, the oak staves in the hands of these strange elves flashed with green light. Amidst a burst of mist, their bodies transformed into violent earth bears and fire wolves as they pincer attacked Bliss. The 14 scorpions and a large group of druids immediately clashed on the airship's deck. The sword dancers and druids had already appeared, and the flower elves, who had the most number of elves, were naturally not to be left behind. This was a group of flower fairies that were only the size of 2 palms and had cicada-like thin wings on their backs. They looked like miniature versions of female elves. Their curvaceous bodies were not clothed, only relying on some entangling vines to cover their vital parts. Their skin was green, their hair was green, and their eyes were a strange black. These flower fairies were a kind of nature attribute monster. Their attack method was their fast-flying speed and terrifying claws. There was no doubt that their claws contained a deadly poison. The magus that could transform into insects did not seem to be easy to deal with. These flower elves, who bullied the weak and feared the strong, targeted the female magus who was lying on the ground on her last breath. It was a pity that there was a tall flame demon standing there, spewing flames all over his body. Any flower elf that entered within 50 meters of him would wail miserably as their bodies spontaneously combusted. This immediately frightened the flower elves, causing them to fly around the tall flame demon like a swarm of hornets. However, they did not dare to charge into the faint layer of flames. That flame demon is a rank 2 magus. I'll go deal with him. You try to get rid of this big insect. Isaac yelled at the female elf captain and led 7 or 8 druids towards Grim. The female elf captain looked at the tall flame demon that Grim had transformed into with a solemn expression. Her heart was unusually heavy. They had killed a female magus and heavily injured another. It seemed like this was a glorious battle, but the surviving magi were getting more and more difficult to deal with. If a few fellows of the same strength came out of the airship, today's battle would probably. However, just as she was thinking, the 10 battle magic machines had already formed a dense formation and began to charge at the elves. Chapter 622. Sometimes it had to be said that there was a mutual restraint between the different types of soldiers. The flower fairies were strange creatures. Although they weren't big, they had a speed that normal people couldn't see with their naked eyes. They also had sharp claws and terrifying poison. If they met this kind of opponent in the forest, even if they outnumbered them several dozen times, they would still be slowly ground to death. Not to mention, there was a large group of them here. However, when the flower fairies and sword dancers met the archer magic weapons, it was like meeting their nemesis from their previous life. It didn't matter if they flew fast or if their dodging skills were at the highest level, the archer magic weapons didn't care at all. They used a storm of metal to wash away their enemies. If the archer magic weapon's opponent was a human heavy armored swordsman, they could use their thick armor to block some of the damage. However, there were many agile warriors among the elves, and in order not to affect the flexibility of their limbs and the dexterity of their bodies, they often wore leather armor or no armor. Facing the archer magic weapons with this kind of defense was simply sending them to their deaths. The dense metal bullets shot out at a speed hard to see with the naked eye, immediately causing terrifying casualties to the sword dancers and flower fairies. Their delicate and slender bodies were torn to shreds in the violent and ferocious metal storm, and the whole sky burst into green blossoms of blood. Damn, what kind of weapon is this? The female elven captain who had seen a magic energy firearm for the first time was about to go crazy with anger. In just a few short seconds, the close combat members she had brought were almost completely wiped out by the other side. After the other side quickly wiped out the flower fairies and sword dancers, they turned around and concentrated their firepower on the group of druids. This group of druids was worthy of being elites that had experienced hardships. The ones charging at the front saw that the situation was bad and roared out, causing their bodies to inflate like balloons. Short, thick black hair quickly spread out from their bodies. They crouched on the ground, and as they let out mournful roars, the muscles around their mouths were also expanding and tearing. Their facial bones twisted and protruded forward, turning into flat and wide beast mouths. In less than 3 seconds, these druids had already turned into terrifying, violent earth bears. They slammed their thick forelimbs on the ground and roared as they charged at the archer magic weapons. Some of the druids behind them turned into flame leopards, night saber leopards, berserk apes, and razor boars. In an instant, the druid team turned into a group of beasts of all kinds. With the cover of the 3 violent earth bears, they quickly rushed towards a magic machine that was spitting out angry bullets. At this moment, the Tier 2 druid stood before the towering flame demon, staring at it from a distance. Although both of them were Tier 2, Druid's aura was clearly inferior to Grimm's. One was a mediocre person who lived a comfortable life in a middle dimension, while the other was a killer who had experienced many dimensional expeditions and had a heart of steel. When the two of them faced off against each other, it clearly displayed the Balrog's strength and ruthlessness. On the other hand, the druid's eyes flickered, as if he was suffocating from the oppressive aura. Their spiritual consciousness was also closely related to the changes in their mental state. When the Tier 2 druid's mind was in a mess, Grimm, who was facing him from a distance, had already sensed it. He laughed maniacally and disappeared into the rising flames. Not good. Isaac's heart trembled violently. He could no longer use his mental strength to track the flame demon's movements. He hurriedly took 2 steps back, and his entire body began to distort crazily. Unfortunately, before his wild instinct transformation could be completed, a strong gust of wind swept behind him, and a 10-meter-long flaming whip whipped his body with a whistling gust of wind. Roar! Isaac raised his neck and let out a long howl of pain. He rolled on the ground and dodged the flaming whip's entanglement. He did not have the time to deal with the black whip mark on his back that made him grimace in pain. He held his oak staff with both hands and slammed it on the ground. In the next second, a violent bolt of lightning that was as thick as a stone pillar descended from the sky, striking the flame demon's huge and terrifying body of flames. After the blinding lightning dissipated, the two powerhouses switched positions and once again fell into an anxious confrontation. But this time, the left hand that Grimm used to block the lightning had turned into a puff of black ash, and Isaac's vine robe was torn to pieces, revealing his bloody back. 270 degrees. Grimm shook his charred left hand slightly, letting the charred rock layer on the surface peel off, revealing the steaming black magma underneath. The enemy's violent attack, just now, was indeed powerful, but it was clearly not enough to take down Grim with such an attack. Therefore, after a few flicks of his fingers, the flames protecting his body spread to his left hand, and Grim sneered as he began to leap with Flame Leap again. Isaac did not have Grim's terrifying recovery ability. Although the whip mark on his back had stopped bleeding, it was still hard to avoid the excruciating pain when he moved. Seeing that his opponent had disappeared again, Isaac hurriedly waved his staff and erected a natural barrier around him. Only then did he carefully search for his opponent's location. Unfortunately, Grim's target for this flaming leap was not him. With a loud bang, Grim stepped on an elemental ring of fire and appeared in the midst of the druid beasts besieging Billis. Damn it, the enemy actually went to find trouble with his underlings. Isaac seemed to have woken up from a dream. He roared and quickly transformed into a wind eagle. His entire body turned into a hurricane and rushed towards the battlefield. But it was too late. When Grim appeared, the elemental ring of fire swept in all directions. All the magical beasts that were caught in it roared mournfully and turned into torches that soared into the sky. The stronger ones could still rely on their own natural energy to run out of the range of the elemental ring of fire and extinguish the flames on their bodies. As for those who were slightly weaker, they were directly annihilated by the elemental halos that filled their bodies. Grim, who had transformed into a tall Balrog, moved his thick legs and leisurely strolled through the raging flames. From time to time, he would condense a magma fireball and throw it at the densest area of the druids. The dozen or so Grade 1 druids that were surrounding Insect Lich Billis and attacking him one after another were immediately met with a terrifying calamity. Whether it was the energy resistance around their bodies, the defensive stone skin, or the powerful nature's protection, none of them could withstand the 312-degree magma fireball that Grim casually threw out. The moment the lava ball exploded, every druid that was targeted by Grim could only howl in pain as they turned into human-shaped torches. Then, they were burned into piles of ashes in just a few seconds. The Grade 1 druids couldn't even withstand a single blow from a Grade 2 fire wizard that had come from another world. After killing 7 druids in a single breath, the remaining few transformed into magical beasts and fled to the surroundings. This also revealed Worm Lich Billis, who was being beaten up in the center of the battlefield. Worm Lich Billis' ability was indeed strange and powerful, but he was only a Grade 1 wizard. Even if he had the advantage in strength, he couldn't withstand the attacks of a dozen druids of the same rank. In less than a quarter of an hour, 5 of the 14 stinger scorpions of Bug, which Bliss had been smashed to death. The remaining ones were all wounded and looked extremely miserable. However, it was because of the protection of these thorn scorpions that Worm Lich Billis didn't die under the terrifying claws of the druids. After dispersing the horde of druids, Grim turned around to look at the Grade 2 druids that were pouncing at him. He grabbed Billis' skinny body and disappeared into the rising flames. After jumping out of the druid's encirclement with Billis, Grim staggered out of the pillar of fire. He released Billis and pulled out the elven feather arrow that had pierced deep into his right shoulder. Grim straightened his body and held the arrow tightly in his hand. His eyes were burning with flames as he stared at the beautiful figure standing on the side of the ship. It was the female elf captain. It was this female elf who had taken advantage of the moment before he activated Flame, jumped to ambush him with an arrow. If it weren't for Grim's vigilance and shrugging his shoulders in time, the arrow would have pierced through his brain, causing him to suffer greatly. The crimson flames in his hand surged, the temperature rising rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had reached a temperature close to white. The decorative feather of the elven feather arrow had already turned to ashes the moment it entered the flame barrier. The remaining metal shaft had already melted into a puddle of molten iron under the scorching heat of the flames, dripping onto the ground through the gaps in Grim's lava hand, burning small holes into the metal deck. The female elf captain's complexion was pale as she silently endured Grim's mental pressure. Even though her body had begun to tremble slightly, she had no intention of retreating. Grimm's tall and terrifying flaming body took a step forward. A terrifying smile appeared on his flaming face. "Since you're here, don't think of leaving. All of you stay." Following Grimm's roar, several hatches on the airship opened at the same time and swarms of archer magic weapons poured out. In the next second, a storm of metal bullets obscured everyone's vision. Retreat, retreat, retreat into the forest. Seeing that the situation on the battlefield had gone out of their control, the Grade 2 Druid Isaac and the female elf captain shouted at the same time. Unfortunately, the druids who were attacking the magic weapons were too deep into the deck. It was too late for them to retreat now. Amidst the barrage of metal bullets, the druids who had transformed into magical beasts staggered as they retreated. However, their bodies were splattered with blood, and a large patch of the flight deck was dyed red. Isaac stared at the scene in front of him with widened eyes. He roared and was about to charge forward again, but was stopped by the female elf captain. "We have to go. The kingdom needs the information we have." Itzhak's body shook, and a trace of calmness returned to his eyes that were filled with rage. "Go." Chapter 6:23. The funeral of the witch Aurelian was held on a cliff in the Valley of Spears. The pile of wood was set ablaze, licking the body of the young witch bit by bit, and finally turning everything into a pile of ashes. Witches were not members of this world, so their souls could not find peace here. To prevent Aurelian's soul from wandering, Alice personally presided over the funeral and tried her best to collect some fragments of her soul from the ashes. When they returned to the wizard world in the future, Alice only needed to break the soul crystal to let Aurelian's broken soul return to the Mother Spirit River. For a dead wizard, this was the highest honor he could enjoy. At the funeral, Grimm and the others only went forward to give their blessings, but the Destiny witches who came together all cried bitterly. It was obvious that after living together for almost 100 years, the relationship between the Destiny witches had become very close and harmonious. This was a stark contrast to the relationship between the wizards of other factions. More than half of the elves who came to attack the floating ship were left behind, and the rest were scattered into the surrounding forest. Even with Grimm's spiritual perception, it was very difficult to locate them in the forest. So after chasing for 2 miles and killing 5 female elven archers, the rest of the elves had already escaped without a trace. As for the Grade 2 druid and the female elf captain, their stealth ability was even more extraordinary. Grimm ignited nearly half a mile of the forest in one go, but he still could not catch up to them. It seemed that in the future, when fighting against the elves in the forest, finding their ambush would be the most difficult part. In the previous battle, Grimm had summoned all of his companions. That way, they would have had a better chance of killing the Tier 2 druid. However, considering the subsequent battle, Grimm still forced Mary, Zatcha, Alice, and the others to stay in the cabin, and only sent some magic equipment to surround the elves. Although this caused more elves to escape, it also ensured that the wizards on the floating ship did not completely expose their power. Not all of the attacking elves were killed, but some of them were still alive. Therefore, these elven warriors became the best specimens and biological test subjects for the wizards. Some were dissecting, and some were feeding the worms. Soon, the elves were exhausted. The higher-ups of the Crimson family sat together and discussed. They all agreed that the reason the elves were able to accurately ambush them here was because their actions a few days ago were too straightforward. They had ventured deep into the magic illusion forest 5 times in a row just to explore the mine. It would be strange if the Elf Kingdom did not make a fuss over such information. After some discussion, the sorcerers unanimously decided to start a guerrilla war. Every time they fired a shot, they would move to a different location. Every time they attacked, they would try their best to wipe out the enemy and create a diversion so that the enemy would not be able to figure out their next target. After coming to a decision, the airship took to the skies once more and flew toward the outer seas. Initially, Tamo suggested attacking the nearest elven village, But Grimm gave up on the idea after some thought. From now on, he wasn't willing to let his thoughts be read by the other party, so he wouldn't do anything to vent his anger or seek revenge. The Callan continent was so big, and there were so many targets for them to choose from. They didn't have to worry about not finding targets to kill. This was the Elven Kingdom, and the people living here were all Elven citizens. As long as they killed enough, they would be able to take revenge for today's attack. With the airship's flying speed, it only took 2 days to return to the coastline. After that, the giant ship didn't stop and flew straight into the open sea, only coming to a stop after traveling 100 kilometers into the open sea. At this position, even if there were Elven scouts following them, it would be difficult to continue chasing them in the endless sea. After getting rid of any possible traces, the airship turned south and flew toward the southern coastline of the Callan continent. This was actually a strategy that Grimm and the others came up with. Their goal this time was to obtain the Prophecy Scepter, and the Prophecy Scepter was the hidden treasure of the Tier 2 Green Dragon Augu. So, if they wanted to steal it, the most important thing was to lure Augu out of Dragon Cliff. Even if they couldn't get the Green Dragon to move, they had to find a way to get the main force and powerhouses of the Elven Kingdom out. Otherwise, trying to steal the Prophecy Scepter would be suicide. If they wanted to go deep into the Elven Kingdom to touch the whiskers of a rank 2 Green Dragon, they would most likely encounter those terrifying Elven oracles. According to the records of the sorcerers, those who relied on the faith of the people to ascend to godhood also faced the same awkward situation as the great sorcerers, which was that they would be repelled by the power of the plane outside the plane barrier, and could only rely on the plane barrier to build their own divine kingdom in the outer realm. Those gods as high as rank 5 or 6 simply couldn't penetrate the planar barrier and enter the interior of the planar barrier. So in order to project their power in the planar barrier, they would find ways to cultivate their own faction of God's children or oracles. In this way, when their own church or kingdom was in danger, the gods could project part of their power through the children of God or oracles. The Elven Kingdom was constantly eulogized in various legends of miracles. The avatars of the gods walked the earth, spreading the voice and will of the gods everywhere. In reality, these were not gods descending to the mortal world. Instead, the gods used the bodies of the children or oracles to carry out their will. Those who could successfully ascend to godhood and ascend to godhood were basically existences at rank 5 and above. The main gods of the pantheons were often powerful existences at rank 6. However, due to the limitations of divine power and rank, the power they could project back to the planar barrier was also different. For example, the elven god Sylvia was a rank 6 god. Just the power she could project back could create a peak rank 4 oracles to act in her place. On the other hand, the god of archery, Marco, was able to summon a divine emissary of the 4th order. As for the weakest rank 5 goddess of moonlight, Mivi, she could only project a rank 3 oracles. So it was almost impossible to kill a god, because their bodies were not in the planar barrier at all. The only way to truly kill a god was to break through the planar barrier and kill their way into the divine kingdom in one fell swoop. This was the only way to kill a god once and for all. If they could only kill the god's oracles on the ground, it would not take long for the god to find a way to create another one. As long as the god did not die, there would never be a shortage of oracles. This was why Grimm commanded the floating ship to roam around the periphery of the Callan continent. He did not dare to venture deep into the continent, fearing that he would encounter a powerful elven oracle. With the power of faith in the Elven Kingdom, even the weakest oracles would have around rank 3 strength. Although the floating ship carried the greatest amount of power Grimm could muster, if he were to face a rank 3 oracles, he would have no choice but to flee. After all, Grimm had already witnessed the might of a rank 3 powerhouse, and it was as powerful as he had expected. This was something he could understand from the rank 3 Thunder Dragon's unparalleled might. Even if Grimm gathered all the rank 2 wizards in his family and invited the Dragon Eater Olina, it would still be difficult for them to contend against the rank 3 Thunder Dragon. In fact, even if they were all tied together, they might not even last 8 minutes against the Thunder Dragon's apocalyptic lightning. It was very difficult to make up for this difference in power level and racial superiority through combat techniques and killing methods. For now, Grim had to do everything he could to avoid fighting a rank 3 enemy. Grim could not afford the price he had to pay to defeat an enemy. Moonshadow Village. The once peaceful elven village was now in a state of chaos. Less than a tenth of the elven garrison managed to make it back to Moonshadow Village. Furthermore, the female elven captain who led the team brought back a terrifying piece of news. The terrifying floating ship was near Moonshadow Village, and it could come at any time to retaliate against the elves. Isaac, who had split up halfway, had already returned to the central mountain range. He would report the information about the floating ship to the elven commander as soon as possible. The female elf captain hurriedly returned to Moonshadow Village and began to organize the villagers to move as soon as possible. For most of the elves, they would only choose to venture out when they were young. Once they reached middle age, they would return to their birthplace and live quietly and peacefully. Hence, to the villagers of Moonshadow Village, this was the home they had lived in for their entire lives. If not for the female elf captain's constant urging, no one would be willing to leave this familiar land and forest. Even if they had to leave, every elf would be laden with bags of various sizes and would turn back every few steps as they walked forward. The reluctance in their eyes was heartbreaking. Even though the female elf captain was extremely reluctant to leave this place for the sake of everyone's safety, she hardened her heart and forced the elves to move faster. However, at this moment, the elf scout she had left near the Valley of Spears ran back, panting. What? The enemy has already left. They're flying toward the coastline. The female elf captain clutched the elf scout's arms tightly, unable to believe her ears. Oh, the evil Magus has left. We don't have to leave our home anymore. Upon hearing the news, the elves who were reluctant to leave their homeland immediately cheered, and some even began to sing and dance. However, the female elf captain's brows furrowed deeper and deeper, and her gaze toward the distance became more and more serene. Could those magi really bear with this and not take revenge for their comrades? Chapter 624. The airship glided slowly above the clouds. Dozens of metal eyeballs the size of human heads floated in the forest below the airship, emitting a faint blue glow. They shuttled back and forth between the lush treetops and the twisting vines, constantly shooting out faint red rays to scan every suspicious shadow in the forest. With the detection runes and infrared rays embedded in the metal eyeballs, anything with life signs could not escape their detection and scanning. With the help of the eyeballs, even if the wizards were high up in the sky, they could still see the situation below like the back of their hands. The metal eyeballs were huge magical machines. From the outside, they did not seem to be equipped with any offensive weapons. However, if they were attacked by an enemy, they only needed to increase the intensity of the red rays to quickly change from infrared scanning to scorching rays. The scorching rays with an attack power of up to 30 degrees might not be enough to deal with high-grade magical beasts, but it was more than enough to deal with ordinary forest beasts. Therefore, along the way, the red, scorching rays in the forest sizzled. Every red ray that flashed by meant the death of a lowly life. Four-legged snakes, horned goats, mountain wolves, owls, turtle doves. These harmless forest creatures were completely annihilated this time. They did not even have time to understand the situation before they were killed by the floating metal eyeballs. The metal eyeballs were like the coldest and bloodiest killers. They would not let go of any living creatures with warmth and life force. They formed groups of 3 and formed a large killing net. They followed a fixed route and killed all the living beings they sensed along the way. Driven by the ferocious killing intent of the metal eyeballs, the alert forest creatures had no choice but to run out of their caves, tree holes, or crypts and escape into the depths of the forest without looking back. Those who were slightly slower in escaping were killed by the terrifying scorching rays one after another. This was an area near the coastline. According to the information Grimm obtained, there should be a small elven village nearby. However, as an outsider, even with Tomo's guidance, it was still very difficult to find a well-hidden elven village in the forest. Therefore, Grimm had no choice but to use this method to alert the elves. They had suffered a huge loss on the west coast and lost one witch. The other, who had been seriously injured, had managed to save her life after some recuperation, but it would be difficult for her to recover her fighting strength in a short period of time. Because of this, Grimm couldn't wait to find these elves and slaughter them. In a floating warship high above the clouds, dozens of light screens were constantly changing the scene, completely displaying everything that was happening in the forest below. Every time the metal eyeball discovered a troublesome magical beast or magical plant, Grimm would use the communication device beside him to call for Tigula, who was following behind the eyeball. Therefore, the three magical mechanical warriors took turns to attack and continuously cleaned up these thorns that suddenly appeared. No matter how powerful and strange the forest magical beasts and magical plants were, they could not withstand the bombardment of metal bullets or the burning of magic flames. Soon, they fell under the muzzles of the magic mechanical warriors. Finally, with the appearance of the small-scale beast horde, Grimm found some clues. An antelope and a brown bear were mixed in the beast tide and were frantically fleeing into the distance. However, the strange thing was that no matter how they ran, they seemed to be inseparable and never separated. It's those low-grade druids that can transform again. Grimm sneered and quickly issued a series of orders. The large net that the metal eyeball had pulled shifted slightly, silently avoiding the antelope and the brown bear's position, and turned to another line of defense. In the dark, where the opponents could not detect, a thorn scorpion and a red-eyed, sharp-mouthed bat quietly followed them. After the antelope and the brown bear escaped the danger zone, they strangely gathered together and muttered a few words. Then, the antelope continued to jump behind the metal eyeball, observing the situation from afar. The brown bear, on the other hand, rushed into the forest without looking back and ran somewhere far away. In the evening, the thorn scorpion and old fox Vinlier sent a message from afar at the same time. They found the elven hut. Therefore, without hesitation, the floating airship descended into the clouds. After returning the metal eyeball and the magic mechanical warriors to the deck, it once again rose into the clouds and disappeared without a trace under the cover of the night. The cautious antelope seemed to have sensed that something was wrong, and immediately turned around and ran in the direction of the elven hut. Elven hut. This was an elven village adjacent to the coastline. The village was not big, and there were only 100 or so elves living in it. There were no tall buildings made of stone or exquisite residences here, only small wooden houses and wooden platforms built on the branches of tall, ancient trees. The tree houses were very simple, but between the tree houses, there were hanging bridges made of wrought tan and wooden planks. When the breeze blew through the forest, the wrought tan hanging bridges swayed, and the flowers and plants on them fluttered in the wind. It was very pleasing to the eye. Since the population of the small village was too small, it was impossible to raise large magical beasts and fierce magical plants. Therefore, the regular soldiers of the village were flower fairies, sword dancers, and elven archers. As for the only two junior druids, because they were born here, they chose to stay in the green hut. It was already nightfall. On the tallest ancient tree in the village, the female elven captain Leafia stood on the wooden platform where the elves practiced archery, silently looking into the distance. Leafia slowly came to the edge of the platform, closed her eyes, and used the power of her soul to silently sense the message coming from the distance. This was the home of the elves. Every blade of grass, every tree, every flower, every fruit, even every ancient tree, every vine, every small flower, every small animal in the forest, Leafia could call out their names and talk to them intimately. No one could catch the elves in the forest because all the plants and animals in the forest were their companions. They would help them eliminate all traces of their existence and become their eyes that were everywhere. Just like Leafia standing in the wind, Even if she did not open her eyes, she could vaguely sense all the movements and unusual movements within a few miles. If there was danger, the forest would warn her and the animals would let out strange cries. Even the rustling of the ancient trees in the wind could give her the necessary information. But for some reason today, a dangerous aura lingered in her heart, but she could not sense where it came from at all. During the day, there was a terrifying aura coming from the southern forest. Out of consideration for safety, Leafia sent the only 2 junior druids in the village to investigate. According to the Cid that came back, Sharpteeth's description, there seemed to be a group of terrifying monsters that were wildly slaughtering the animals in the forest. There were quite a few of them, and they were very strong, so the 2 druids could only hide in the shadows and silently follow them, not daring to come out and chase them away. When the sky darkened, Leafia was worried about the druid outside, so she sent out 2 flower fairies to help. But up until now, there had been no news at all. This was what Leafia was most worried about. Big Sister Leafia, Big Sister Leafia. When the female elven captain was the most worried, a young male and female elven boy and girl ran to her side. Big Sister Leafia, quickly come and see. I was able to hit 2 willow leaves just now. The young elven girl pulled Leafia's arm and gently shook it. The arrow she raised high in the air had 2 thin willow leaves pierced through it. You only hit 2 willow leaves? What's the big deal? Sister Leafia, look at me, I hit 3. Another young elf was also proudly holding an arrow with 3 willow leaves pierced through it. The young elven girl immediately pouted and angrily glared at the young elven youth. For the elves who were proficient in archery, shooting at a fixed target was something only those little fellows who hadn't reached adulthood could do. If one wanted to become an elven archer, the most basic requirement was to shoot through 5 light willow leaves with 1 arrow. And the 2 little fellows in front of her could shoot through 2 and 3. This was already very rare. Leafia forced a smile and reached out to gently rub their soft and smooth short green hair. She was about to say something encouraging when she suddenly found that everything in front of her was dark. It seemed that the whole world had become dark and gloomy. The female elven captain looked up in fright. Only then did he realize that the bright moon hanging high in the sky seemed to be covered by something, causing the entire elven village to lose its moonlight. With Leafia's sharp eagle eyes, she naturally saw it clearly. It was not the clouds, but rather an incomparably large metal ship falling from the sky, aiming at the elven hut below. And the shape of the other side, was that a Cid? That terrifying evil monster that Fong had described. Enemy attack. Amidst the mournful cries, battle magical machines, up to 4 meters tall wrapped in strange metal shells, descended from the sky along the metal ropes. Thud, 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 thud. They landed everywhere in the elven village. In the next second, the metal barrage crazily shot towards every moving individual. One after another, goblin arrows ejected foot-long tail flames and whistled towards the tree houses. Chapter 6:25. The battle only lasted for a quarter of an hour before it ended. Facing the enemies that fell from the sky, facing the fully armed magic machines, the elves' counterattack was weak. Their accurate and swift arrows were completely useless against the invulnerable metal magic machines. As for the flower fairies and sword dancers who only had close-range combat ability, they had no way of dodging the ranged attacks of the metal magic machines. No matter how fast they flew, they could not outrun the bullets. No matter how fast they swung their swords, they could not block the barrage of bullets. One by one, the flower fairies and sword dancers rushed out from their hiding places. Their sharp claws and swords scratched the bodies of the metal magic machines, causing sparks to fly. They slashed at the metal magic machines, but could not hurt them at all. The other magic machines in the distance turned their muzzles without hesitation and flooded the area with a violent barrage of metal bullets. They did not seem to care about whether they would accidentally hurt their own people or not. Actually, there was no need to care. When the barrage of bullets stopped, there was only one living thing that could stand in the center of the attack. It was the metal magic machine that had been besieged just now. Around it, the flower fairies and sword dancers were all riddled with holes. They were thrown all over the place like rags. The metal magic machine moved its body, not caring about the holes on its body, and continued to advance with heavy and steady steps towards the area where the elves were concentrated. How powerful could a small village at the edge of the elven kingdom be? Therefore, when they encountered the magic machine squad that was far more powerful and well-prepared than them, they were shot down one by one without any chance to fight back. Then, they became the wizard's captives. The only thing that made people's eyes light up was the female elf captain, Leafia, and the druid Cid, Fangs. One of them was a grade 1 elven archer, and the other was a grade 1 beginner druid. Once they went all out, they could still cause some damage to the metal magic machines. The beginner druid held an oak staff in one hand and sprinkled iron thorn seeds in the other, summoning a cluster of iron thorns from the ground and trapping an archer magic machine in place. Leafia let out a low shout and shot out 2 elven arrows that shone with a green halo. In an instant, 2 arrows pierced deep into the chest of the archer magic machine. It was a pity that the energy core was not there for the magical machine that relied on the magical battery, so the 2 arrows were not enough to paralyze it and cause it to self-destruct. In the next second, the 2 arms of the archer mechanical machine were raised high, and the octuple magic musket instantly flooded Leafia's position with a violent barrage of metal bullets. There wasn't the deafening roar of an ordinary goblin musket, nor was there the huge smoke produced by the explosion of gunpowder. Metal pellets were constantly ejected from the mystic musket. Leafia's delicate and graceful body was constantly bursting with blood and the crisp sound of bones breaking. When the crazily spinning guns finally stopped firing, the once beautiful female elf captain was only left with a horrifying bloody corpse, lightly falling to the ground. Leafia, druid Cid, its sharp fangs howled miserably, its green pupils instantly filled with blood. It howled and quickly transformed into a terrifying violent earth bear, roaring as it charged at the archer magic equipment. The mystic musket on the arms of the archer magic machine spat out a series of pellets once again, causing blood to splatter all over the body of the ferocious violent earth bear. But Cid? Fong relied on the powerful physique of the violent earth bear to force his way to the archer magic machine. With a loud roar, the violent earth bear stood up on its hind legs, its 2 huge bare paws slamming fiercely on the body of the archer magic machine. The humanoid design of the archer magic machine made the balance of the archer magic machine far inferior to that of the spider magic machine. The violent earth bear immediately pounced forward and tangled with the archer magic machine. The beast-like roars, the dull impact that made one's eyes twitch, and the crisp and continuous sound of gunfire. All the sounds intertwined together, from intense to dull, and from dull to low. Gradually, all the sounds disappeared without a trace. When the other magic machines finished cleaning up the elven village and arrived at the battlefield, they only saw the remains of 2 tightly huddled bodies. The druid violent earth bear's abdomen had been pierced through, its broken internal organs flowing out, and blood soaked the ground beneath it. The archer magic machine was also in a mess, as if it had been trampled by the violent earth bear's feet. Its metal body was distorted beyond recognition, and it was completely destroyed. After the battle ended, the metal magic machines began to search the surroundings with the help of the metal eyeballs. The ruined elven village was handed over to the wizards for research. The surviving elves and flower fairies were sent to the floating airship, and the poisoned centipede Ender was in charge of interrogating them. They had to find out the exact location of the surrounding elven settlements, as well as the location of the nearest elven city. Although the half-elf Taimaw could remember the location of all the elven cities, he could not pinpoint the exact location of all the elven villages. After all, it had been almost 100 years since he left this land. 100 years was enough for everything he was familiar with to change beyond recognition. With the strength of Grimm and the others, trying to ambush the elven cities was akin to seeking death. However, It was within their capabilities to sweep through the elven city and wipe out all of their outlying strongholds and towns. As qualified wizards, Grimm and the others personally extracted the hair, flesh, and internal organs of the flower fairies and elves. Especially after obtaining the plague poison spirit, Grimm could easily use these extracts to extract plague seeds that could target them. However, the elves and flower fairies were natural creatures and had extraordinary resistance to diseases and poisons. It was simply wishful thinking to rely on the plague to get rid of them once and for all. However, Grimm was very happy to be able to cause some trouble for them. After the battle, the ones who were most satisfied with the harvest were the vampires and the insect Lich Bliss. It had to be said that the elves were the children of the forest, and their bodies naturally contained a dense aura of nature. The blood that contained magical energy was undoubtedly the vampire's favorite food. Therefore, Mary personally picked out a few of the best quality elves and flower fairies from the captive and locked them up as food for the vampires. The broken remains of the elves were collected by the insect Lich Bliss. In a secret room at the belly of the ship, Bliss had just built a new insect nest that needed a large amount of fresh blood to irrigate. The remains of the elves came at the right time. Apart from these, the wizards also found many strange elven items from the destroyed tree houses. Most of them were various kinds of plant seeds and fruits, which were not very useful to wizards. However, there were also some things that were of great significance. For example, the natural fruit that was plucked from a 1,000-year-old oak tree could prolong a normal human's life. However, to wizards, it could only be used as a plant-type ingredient to refine natural resistance potions. In battles against the elves, this natural resistance potion seemed to be an indispensable support potion. Of course, apart from a natural fruit, the wizards also found some strange wood needed to make magic staffs, as well as some natural magic gems embedded in them. However, Grimm did not care about any of these. The only thing that moved him was an unexpected discovery. At the top of the tallest ancient tree in the elven village, Dacella found a very well-hidden tree hole. When Grimm passed through the narrow tree hole and brushed away the hanging green vines, he was shocked to see a small nature altar. The so-called small altar was actually a tree stump with a diameter of 1 meter. On top of it, there was a groove that looked like a pool. When Grimm arrived, he could clearly see the bright moonlight shining through a hole at the top of the tree hole, shining straight into the groove. Inside the groove, there was a small amount of green spring water rippling. As Grimm approached the tree stump, he could feel the aura of life rushing towards him. At the same time, he also felt a trace of holy aura. Moon water. This was probably the so-called treasure of the elves, the moon water. Grimm took a deep breath, turned his head, and ordered, "Hurry up and invite Alice." But before Dacella could leave, Alice's clear and soft voice could be heard. "No need to shout. I'm already here." Grimm laughed and said, "Hey, you have a dog's nose. I didn't even shout, and you already smelled it." After saying this, he did not care about his image and laughed heartily. Alice rolled her eyes at him in annoyance. However, as soon as she approached the tree stump, her eyes were firmly attracted to the green water. "Moon water. It's moon water, what? There's moon water here?" The few witches who followed her exclaimed in disbelief. Alice tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then, she seemed to understand something. She walked to the tree stump and tapped it a few times, opening a secret compartment. From inside, she took out a palm-sized wooden statue. For some reason, this wooden statue was overflowing with a strange, obscure, and indescribable energy wave, which made every living creature who saw it feel an urge to kneel down and worship it. "I knew it. Grimm, we can't stay here for too long. This is a village under the protection of the gods." Huh? Grimm was confused. "What's this wooden statue? With the population and structure of this village, there shouldn't be a treasure like the moon water here. But now it has appeared. This can only mean that this place is blessed by the god of moonlight. This wooden statue is the statue of the god of moonlight, and the elves in this village are most likely believers of the god of moonlight. If we stay here for too long, it is very likely that we will attract great trouble. Understand? I'll go and arrange the retreat. I'll leave everything here to you." Grim made a prompt decision and immediately walked out of the tree hole. "Don't just stand there and watch. Let's move everything here together," Alice immediately ordered. The witches immediately rushed forward with smiles on their faces. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.